Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to AZKABAN. In today's episode, we explore what if Harry discovered Snape was his real father the night before Hogwarts. Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The letter that came at midnight. The Dursleys went to bed at 10 o'clock on the dot, the way they always did. Uncle Vernon locking up with the practiced efficiency of a man who believed locks could keep the world sensible. Aunt Petunia folding her dressing gown over the bathroom rail with surgical precision. Dudley thundering up the stairs like a small, malevolent earthquake. The house settled into its familiar nighttime sounds. The creak of the master bed, the gurgle of pipes, the faint drone of Uncle Vernon snoring starting up like an engine that never quite turned over properly. Harry lay on his cot in the cupboard under the stairs and stared at the wooden slats above his face and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Tomorrow was the day. Tomorrow he was leaving. He'd packed his trunk 3 times already. He knew exactly where everything was, his robes folded at the bottom, his textbooks stacked in order of size the way he'd been taught to keep things neat, his wand lying along the inner right edge in its paper wrapping because he didn't have a proper case for it. He'd read every textbook twice in the past month. He couldn't help himself. He'd read them the way a starving person eats, fast and almost desperate, and the information had settled into him in a way that school at the Dursleys never had, like it was slotting into places that had always been empty and waiting. He was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, and the combination had kept him from sleeping for 3 nights running. He closed his eyes. He made himself breathe slowly. He was nearly there. Then something hit the cupboard door, not hard, not like a fist, more like something small dropping from a height, a quiet, deliberate thud just above the latch, and when Harry sat up fast enough to knock his head on the underside of the stair, he heard the flutter of wings retreating and then nothing. Absolute silence. He rubbed his head. He waited. Nothing moved in the house above him. Carefully, moving the way he'd learned to move in 10 years of not waking anyone up, Harry eased the cupboard door open. The envelope was on the floor in front of him, not on the doormat by the front door the way post usually came, not on the kitchen table where Aunt Petunia sorted it every morning. Here, right in front of the cupboard, like whatever had delivered it had known exactly where to look. It was a plain envelope, no crest, no official seal, no curly green ink like Hagrid's letter. Just his name in handwriting he had never seen before. Precise. Almost architectural. The letters formed with the kind of controlled care that suggested the writer's natural hand was something else entirely, something more chaotic, but that the person had chosen to write this particular letter slowly and deliberately. Harry Potter. That was all. No address. No stamp. Something was inside, 2 things he could tell from the weight of it. He took it back into the cupboard and pulled his knees up and turned on his small torch and opened it. The first thing that fell out was a vial. Small, glass, stopped with a cork. The liquid inside was the strangest color Harry had ever seen, not quite silver, not quite white, shifting between the two the way oil shifts on water, but more deliberate than that. More alive. It moved when he tilted it even slightly, swirling in a way that didn't follow gravity. He set it carefully on his knee and unfolded the parchment. There were 4 words. Drink this. Then read. And below that, on a second piece of parchment folded separately, he could see it, more writing. Much more. But the instruction was clear. He was supposed to drink it first. Harry looked at the vial for a long time. Any sensible person would have put it down. Any sensible person would have gone back to sleep and shown it to a responsible adult in the morning, except that Harry didn't have any responsible adults, and he was 11 years old and had been doing things his own way since he was old enough to understand that waiting for someone else to do them usually meant they didn't get done at all. He uncorked the vial. It didn't smell like much. Faintly warm. Something like ink and something like cold air and something he couldn't name. A scent that was somehow familiar in the way that a song you can't quite remember is familiar, hovering just below the surface of recall. He drank it. It went down like water, then hit somewhere behind his sternum like a slow-motion collision. Harry gasped, not in pain, but in the way you gasp when something takes you by surprise in the dark, when the world suddenly reorganizes itself around a single point. His vision didn't go dark. It went white, and then it stopped being his vision at all. He was standing in a room he didn't recognize, and he understood immediately that he was not there. He was watching, like a ghost in someone else's memory. The room was a small kitchen, warm and cluttered, and the woman standing at the counter was his mother. Harry knew her from photographs. Hagrid had given him an album in the last few weeks before school, and he'd looked at those photographs more times than he could count, memorizing the shape of her face, the particular brightness of her eyes. But seeing her here, moving, alive, her red hair escaping from a loose braid, her face blotchy from crying and fierce with it, was something entirely different. Something that went directly into the part of him that had no name for what it needed. She was holding a baby. He was small enough that the word newborn applied, wrapped in green blanket, sleeping with the boneless confidence of someone who has no idea what is happening around them. And standing near the door, with his arms folded and his face doing something complicated and painful, was a man Harry recognized from the photographs Dumbledore had shown him in the summer. Tall, lean, dark hair that fell forward into eyes that were the exact color of black coffee. He was younger in this memory than the man Harry had briefly glimpsed when Hagrid had pointed him out at the leaky cauldron. There was less of the carved-in quality to his face, less of the armor, but the essential architecture was the same. Professor Snape, his potions teacher, the man Hagrid had described with clear reservation, the man whose name had come up in every second-hand story Harry had collected about Hogwarts in the last month. "You have to go," Lily was saying. Her voice was not pleading, it was direct, commanding, the voice of someone who has made a decision and needs the other person to catch up. "James will be back in an hour. Save, please. I know what I'm asking you to give up." Snape's voice was quiet. Not the cold, precise thing Harry had been warned it would be, quieter than that and rougher. "I know what this costs. I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I would stay if staying didn't put him in more danger." "I know you would." Lily shifted the baby against her shoulder. The baby, Harry, he realized, that small, unaware bundle was him, stirred but didn't wake. "That's not the problem." "Then what? The problem," Lily said, and her voice cracked on the word in a way she clearly hadn't intended, "is that James loves him. He will love him as his own, and I believe that, and I need you to believe it too, because otherwise I don't know how I live with this." Something moved across Snape's face. Harry couldn't name it. It was too big for a single word. "Does he know?" Snape asked. "Number and I don't." She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again more steadily. "I need him not to know. I need Harry not to know. There are people looking for him already, Severus, and if they know what he is to you, what you are too, if the Dark Lord finds out, I understand." He said it flatly, not bitterly. The flatness of someone who has heard something difficult and chosen to absorb it rather than argue with it. "I need you to understand what I'm asking," Lily said. "I'm asking you to watch him grow up. I'm asking you to be there and be silent. And I know," her voice broke fully now and she didn't try to stop it, "I know what I'm asking. I know it isn't fair. I know there isn't a version of this that isn't terrible for you, Lily." He crossed the room in 3 steps and she met him halfway, and Harry stood in the corner of this kitchen that wasn't his and watched his mother and his father hold each other for a long moment over a sleeping baby who was going to grow up not knowing either of them properly. "He can never know," Lily said into Snape's shoulder. "Not while Voldemort lives. Not while Dumbledore." She pulled back and looked at him directly. "And that's the other thing. Dumbledore cannot know." Something shifted in Snape's expression, something careful. Why? Because Dumbledore would use it. She said it without hesitation, without apology, as if it were simply true. He loves Harry, I believe that, but he would use anything he could to protect the greater good, and if he knew that you and Harry were, she shook her head. He would use it over both of you. Snape was quiet for a moment. Then, how long have you known Albus well enough to believe that of him? Lily almost smiled. Almost. Long enough. The memory began to dissolve at the edges, the way dreams do when you're waking from them. The warm kitchen lightened to white. The figures blurred. The last thing Harry saw clearly was Snape's hand, resting very gently against the green blanket for one moment, before Lily stepped back and the distance between them became permanent. The cupboard came back. Harry was shaking. He didn't know when he'd started, but his hands were trembling against his knees, and the empty vial was still in his fingers. And outside the Dursleys' house, the night had deepened to the particular heavy black of 2 or 3 in the morning when the whole world seems to have stopped. He sat very still and let himself shake and didn't try to stop it. He was 11 years old. He had found out 6 weeks ago that magic was real, and that he was famous for something he couldn't remember doing. He had found out that his parents were murdered, and that a dark wizard had tried to kill him and somehow failed. He had carried all of that with him through a month of shopping and packing and rereading textbooks, and trying not to think too hard about any of it because thinking too hard about it was a fast road to a panic he couldn't afford. And now this. He unfolded the second piece of parchment with hands that were not entirely steady. The handwriting was the same, that controlled, deliberate precision. But this time there was more of it, and whoever had written it had allowed the control to slip slightly as they went, so that by the end of the letter the writing was something rower than the beginning, something that cost more. Harry, I debated for a considerable time whether to send this. I've debated it for 11 years, in fact, and come to the wrong conclusion every time. I'm sending it now because tomorrow you will walk into Hogwarts, and you will see me, and I cannot in good conscience watch you navigate what you are without knowing where some of it comes from. Your mother and I were friends for many years before we were anything else. What we were for a short time is the subject of the memory in the vial, a memory I extracted from my own mind and preserved, which is a thing wizards can do. I think you should know what we said to each other. I think you should know it from us, not from the mangled version of events that rumor and history would eventually hand you. Your mother's name was Lily Evans. She was the most naturally gifted witch I have ever known, and I have known many. She loved without reservation and strategized without mercy, sometimes simultaneously, and she was right about nearly everything. She was right about what she asked me to do. I have taught at Hogwarts for 10 years. I will be your potions teacher. I am going to be difficult. I am going to be harder on you than on other students. Not because I dislike you, but because I will be desperately trying to appear as though I do. And I am asking you to trust me on that even though you have no reason to, and I have given you no reason to. I am telling you this now because you deserve the choice. You can walk into Hogwarts tomorrow knowing what you know and decide what to do with it. You can confront me. You can ignore it. You can tell Dumbledore. You can tell no one. You are your mother's child and you will do whatever seems right to you, and it will probably be the correct decision because she never made the wrong one about the things that mattered. What I want you to know, what I need you to know, is that there has not been a single day of the last 11 years in which I was not aware of you. Knowing you were alive was the one thing I was permitted to have. I held on to it. I am sorry for the circumstances into which you were born. I am sorry for your 10 years with the Dursleys, which your mother feared and which I could not prevent without exposing both of us. I am sorry that the first letter you receive from me is a vial of someone else's memory and a poor explanation. You are not obligated to forgive me anything. I am not asking you to. I am asking you to be careful. Dumbledore is a great man and a good one, and he is also capable of loving you and using you simultaneously. And I say this not to poison your opinion of him, but to give you the truth your mother wanted you to have. You are more than the boy who lived. You have always been more than that. Tomorrow at Hogwarts, try to remember it. Harry read the letter twice. Then he set it down on the cot beside him very precisely with the same care he'd used to pack his textbooks, and he looked at the wooden slats above his head in the dark, and he stayed very quiet for a very long time. He thought about the memory, the warmth of that kitchen, his mother's voice, the particular quality of it when it broke on a word she didn't want to break on, the way Snape had moved across the room, the hand on the green blanket. He thought about 10 years in this cupboard, 10 years of being told he was nothing, 10 years of making himself small enough to avoid being noticed, and he thought about the fact that somewhere across London a man who was his father had known he existed every single one of those days and had held onto it like a lifeline. He wasn't angry. He'd thought he might be, that part of him was expecting to be, but the anger didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and stranger, a kind of settling, like tumblers in a lock clicking into place one after another. Like something that had never quite been right was finding its correct configuration. He was not just James Potter's son. He was not just the boy who lived. He was Lily Evans's son and Severus Snape's son, and nobody had asked his permission to tell him what that meant, and as of this moment he was done with that. He lay down on the cot. He put the letter carefully under his pillow. He stared at the dark above him and thought, I have a father. He teaches at the school I'm going to tomorrow. He's going to pretend not to care about me. He wrote me a letter that took him 11 years. He thought about that for a while. Then he thought, Dumbledore knew about the Dursleys. The letter said Snape couldn't stop it without exposing them, which means Dumbledore could have stopped it and didn't, and chose to let me live in a cupboard for 10 years because it served some purpose. That one took longer to sit with. He'd liked Dumbledore instinctively, had liked the twinkle and the warmth and the sense of safety the man projected. He hadn't questioned it. He hadn't had any reason to. But now, lying in the dark the night before everything changed, Harry turned the information over and examined it the way he'd been examining textbooks, carefully, trying to find what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. Dumbledore had put him with the Dursleys. Dumbledore had reasons for everything. Snape had written, he is capable of loving you and using you simultaneously, and Harry's mother had said, without hesitation or apology, he would use it. Smart people, both of them. People who knew Albus Dumbledore well. People who had come to the same conclusion from two different directions. Harry filed that away, not bitterly, not as something to act on immediately. Just as something he knew now that he hadn't known this morning, the same way he now knew about transfiguration and herbology and the fundamental principles of potion making, things that changed how you saw the world once you had them. He didn't sleep for another hour. And when sleep finally came, it was deep and dreamless, which was unusual for him, and he woke at 6 in the morning feeling, for the first time in recent memory, like himself. Not the self he'd been pretending to be for 10 years in this house. Something underneath that. Something older. He got up and washed his face in the cupboard's small basin, and then carried his trunk into the hallway and sat on it and waited. Aunt Petunia came downstairs at 7 and saw him sitting there in the hallway, trunk packed, dressed, and ready, and something in his face made her stop in the kitchen doorway. "What are you looking at?" she said, the way she always did when she caught him being still in a way that unnerved her. "Nothing," Harry said, the way he always did, and then because he was done with small contractions, "I'm leaving today." "Yes, well," she turned away. "I won't be back until next summer." "Yes." She moved to the kettle. "You should know," Harry said, and his voice came out very even, not angry, just clear, "that I remember every part of the last 10 years. I'll probably remember it for the rest of my life." He picked up his trunk handle. That's all. Petunia didn't turn around, but her shoulders were very still, and the kettle in her hand was very still, and Harry thought that perhaps that was enough. Uncle Vernon came downstairs at 7:30 and drove Harry to King's Cross without a word and left without looking back, which was perfectly fine with Harry, who stood on the pavement with his trunk and his owl, Hedwig. He'd named her Hedwig, the most majestic thing he'd ever owned, and took one breath of London morning air and then headed for the platform. He found the barrier between 9 and 10 by following a family of redheads who moved through it with the casual confidence of people who'd done it 100 times. And then he was on platform 9 3/4, and the Hogwarts Express was there, scarlet and enormous and already beginning to breathe steam into the bright September morning. And Harry's heart did something complicated in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. He loaded his trunk and found an empty compartment near the middle of the train, and stowed Hedwig's cage on the rack and sat down and watched the platform through the window. He watched the redhead family sort themselves out. There were a lot of them, at least 5 or 6 children, and a comfortable-looking woman who appeared to be directing them with the same confident authority as a general deploying troops, and a tall, lanky boy about Harry's age who was trying not to look nervous. He watched a girl with a lot of bushy brown hair and a very new set of robes walking briskly alongside a man and woman who were clearly her parents, squinting at everything with the intent focus of someone committing it all to memory. He watched the platform fill and empty and fill again as the departure time approached. He thought about Snape. He'd decided, sometime in the last hour of the drive to King's Cross, that he wasn't going to pretend not to know. He wasn't going to perform ignorance because it would make things easier for a man who'd written him a letter about not lying. He was going to walk into Hogwarts as exactly what he was, which was someone who knew the truth, and see what happened. He wasn't afraid of Snape. He tried to locate the feeling and it wasn't there. What was there was something more complicated, a kind of curiosity that had sharp edges and underneath it, buried deep but present, a warmth he didn't entirely trust yet. The boy with the bushy hair, no, that was a girl, he could see now, knocked on the compartment door and slid it open. Is anyone sitting here? Everywhere else is full. Go ahead, Harry said. She sat across from him with her trunk on the rack and her hands folded in her lap and the look of someone who has prepared extensively for this journey and is now waiting for it to begin. I'm Hermione Granger, she said. Harry Potter. She didn't react to the name the way everyone else had. No gasp, no wide eyes, no reaching for his forehead to look at the scar. She just nodded like she'd already known that, which Harry supposed she probably had. I've read all the course books already, she said. Have you? Twice, Harry said. This surprised her. She leaned forward slightly. Which was your favorite? Harry thought about it. The standard book of spells was interesting, but the theory was shallow. I actually liked magical theory better than most people seem to. Bagshot explains the underlying mechanics better than anyone else were assigned. Hermione Granger looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested she was recalibrating something. Then she smiled properly, for what might have been the first time all morning. I thought exactly the same thing. Everyone I've talked to said Bagshot was boring. The people who find mechanics boring usually struggle with advanced work later, Harry said. Yes, exactly. She sat up straighter. That's what I said to. She stopped. Started again a little quieter. That's what I tried to explain. Harry understood from the texture of the pause that there were people she'd tried to explain things to who hadn't listened. He knew that particular pause. He'd worn it for years. It'll be different at Hogwarts, he said, not to comfort her but because he genuinely believed it. Hermione nodded. She seemed to be deciding something. Then, do you know which house you're hoping for? No, Harry said honestly. This was also true. He'd thought about it extensively and reached no particular conclusion, because the answer depended on who he was, and who he was had shifted significantly in the last 8 hours. Gryffindor, she said firmly. Bravery and courage, that's what I think I am. Harry looked at her, the way she sat, the way she'd walked into an unfamiliar compartment because the alternative was standing on the platform, the way she'd asked about textbooks before she'd asked about his scar, and thought that she was brave in a specific and underrated way, the way that people who are used to being slightly too much for everyone around them are brave, by continuing anyway. I think you're right, he said. The train lurched into motion. England began sliding past the windows, first the grey of London, then the slow exhale into green, and Harry Potter sat across from the first real friend he thought he might be making and felt the life he'd been living falling away behind the train like smoke. The red-headed boy found the compartment around the halfway point, knocked apologetically, and introduced himself as Ron Weasley with the slightly embarrassed air of someone who suspects they've run out of options. Harry liked him immediately and without effort. There was a straightforwardness to Ron that was refreshing, an absence of guile that was its own kind of intelligence. He said what he thought. He was genuinely enthusiastic about Quidditch in a way that reminded Harry of how he'd felt reading about it in Quidditch through the ages. That particular joy of something discovered that feels like it was always meant for you. Ron tried very hard to perform a spell with a broken wand to impress them and failed, and looked mortified about it. And Harry said, "The wand matters less than the intent when you're first starting." Ollivander told me that, which was not strictly what Ollivander had said but was close enough, and had the desired effect of making Ron look less miserable. Hermione, who had clearly been reading her wand theory extremely carefully, launched into an explanation of why this was mechanically true, and Ron's expression cycled through embarrassment, interest, and grudging acknowledgement that this was actually very interesting. And by the time the witch with the sweets trolley had come and gone, they were talking with the easy rhythm of people who have known each other for much longer than 2 hours. Harry bought enough sweets for all 3 of them. It was the first time he'd spent money on something that wasn't necessary, and the way the coin left his hand was still slightly startling. He didn't tell them about the letter. He didn't know yet what telling them would mean, and he'd learned that information was worth more when you understood it than when you just had it. He sat with it and watched the countryside go past, and felt it inside him, solid and permanent, like a stone in his chest that was somehow not uncomfortable. Around 5 o'clock, as the light was going golden over the hills, Draco Malfoy appeared in the compartment doorway. Harry had already heard about Draco Malfoy, had met him briefly at Madame Malkin's back in July, had registered his particular brand of casual confidence, the kind that was cultivated rather than natural. Now Malfoy stood in the compartment door with 2 large boys flanking him, and his eyes went first to Ron dismissive, then to Hermione dismissive in a different register, then to Harry, and something shifted in his expression. Recalibration. "Harry Potter," Malfoy said, not a question. "Draco Malfoy," Harry said, in exactly the same tone. The corner of Malfoy's mouth did something that wasn't quite a sneer and wasn't quite a smile. "You'll want to be careful about who you make friends with on the train. Some families are," he glanced at Ron, "more useful than others." "Useful," Harry repeated as if tasting the word. "That's an interesting way to choose friends." "It's the practical way." "Practical for what?" Harry asked, genuinely curious with an openness that was not naive. Malfoy paused. This was not the conversation he'd prepared for navigating Hogwarts, for knowing who has influence. "I'll work out who has influence by watching what they do," Harry said, "not by taking inventory of their last name." He looked at Malfoy steadily. "No offense." "Some taken," Malfoy said, and it came out with a crispness that was, Harry thought, the most honest thing he'd said in the exchange. He looked at Harry for another moment with those cool gray eyes, and something worked itself out behind them, and then he left. Ron was already starting what sounded like a prepared speech about Malfoys being the worst sort of wizards, but Harry was watching the window, watching the last light leave the hills, thinking about what Snape had written. "You are more than the boy who lived. You have always been more than that." He turned it over, examined it. The thing was, he'd always known that, somewhere below where words lived. Known it in the way you know something you've never been told, in your hands, in your instincts, in the way certain information slid into you like it was completing a pattern. He'd been pretending to be less for 10 years because it was safer, because the Dursleys punished him when he was more, because being more meant being noticed and being noticed meant consequences. He was done with that. He'd decided this morning in the cupboard, and he'd reaffirmed it on the platform, and he was reaffirming it now on this train as the sky outside went dark, and the Scottish hills rose around them and somewhere ahead through the dark, and the wind Hogwarts was waiting. He was going to walk in as exactly what he was. He just needed to figure out fully what that was. They changed into robes as the train began to slow, and by the time it stopped and Hagrid's enormous voice was calling for first years, Harry had his scarf on and his wand in his pocket, and Hermione beside him and Ron half a step behind. And when Hagrid saw him, his whole face did something warm and complicated, and Harry felt, for a moment, the particular comfort of someone who'd been glad to see him before any of this. "All rig, Harry," Hagrid said, quieter than the rest of the rumbling instruction-giving. "All right," Harry said, and meant it. The boats across the lake were extraordinary. Harry had read about them, and the image in his head had been nothing like this. The water black and still as glass, the castle rising out of it with every window lit, reflected in the surface below so that it looked like two castles facing each other across a perfect dark mirror. He heard Hermione make a small sound beside him, not the sound of someone performing wonder, but the real thing, the involuntary intake of breath at something that is simply, unarguably, beautiful. The great doors. The professor, stern, sharp-eyed, a kind of economical power to the way she moved, who introduced herself as Professor McGonagall and looked at the first years with an expression that said she had done this many times and found it simultaneously routine and quietly important. The ghosts that drifted through the entrance hall and made several people shriek. Ron's whispered explanation of the houses that Harry only half listened to because he was looking at the doors to the great hall and thinking about what was behind them. Not just the sorting, not just the students and the teachers and the floating candles and the enchanted ceiling. Snape was in there. Harry put his hand in his pocket and touched his wand once. A quick grounding touch, the way you check your footing before stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Then McGonagall was leading them through the doors, and Harry Potter walked into the great hall of Hogwarts for the first time with his head up and his eyes open, and absolutely no intention of being anything other than exactly what he was. The hall was everything the books had suggested and still more than he'd expected. The candles, the 4 long tables, the ceiling that was the Scottish night sky above them, the hundreds of older students turning to look as the first years walked in. He could hear the whispers starting, the way they rippled outward from the students nearest him. He looked once down the length of the great hall, scanning the teacher's table. He found Snape immediately, because Snape was already looking at him, and Harry understood in an instant why the man was considered difficult to read. His face gave away almost nothing, a precision of blankness that must take considerable effort to maintain. But his eyes, which were very dark and very still, were looking at Harry with an attention that was unlike the way he was looking at anything else in the room. Harry held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be a challenge. He saw something shift almost imperceptibly in Snape's expression. A fractional tightening. A question. Harry looked away. He turned his attention back to the Sorting Hat on its stool and thought, I know what I am. You're about to find out too. Behind him, Hermione was whispering something to Ron about the enchanted ceiling. The candles above sent warm, unsteady light across the stone walls and the ancient beams and the hundreds of upturned faces. Harry breathed in the smell of it, old stone and wood smoke and something else, something alive, the particular scent of a building that has been full of human beings and their ambitions and their failures and their love for so many hundreds of years that it has absorbed all of it into the stone. He was home, not the way the word home had ever applied before, not as a place that was his because he had nowhere else to go. Home as a destination. Home as a place he had been moving toward. The hat sat on its stool, the list of names waited, and Harry Potter, who had been born in a secret and raised in a lie, and had spent the night reading the truth out of a vial of preserved memory, stood very still in the great hall of Hogwarts, and waited with considerably more patience than anyone around him, and absolutely no fear of what happened next. Chapter 2. The Sorting of Severus Snape's son McGonagall read from the scroll, with the cadence of someone who has done this enough times that the ceremony is no less meaningful for being familiar. Names went down the list alphabetically, which meant Harry had time to watch. The Sorting Hat was a genuinely extraordinary object. He could see it thinking, the brim creasing and shifting as it sat on each new head, and some students it sent quickly, barely settled before the hat was shouting a house name, and others it held for long seconds that stretched visibly uncomfortable for the student underneath. Hannah Abbott went a Hufflepuff in under 10 seconds. Susan Bones followed her. Terry Boot went to Ravenclaw, and a girl named Lavender Brown went to Gryffindor, so fast the hat seemed almost enthusiastic about it. Harry watched each one and catalogued the pattern. The fast sortings were not for simple students. They were for students who already knew what they were, whose nature was so clearly expressed that the hat had very little work to do. The long sortings were for people in between, or people fighting against what they were, or people who were more than one thing simultaneously, and the hat was making a call. He had a feeling his sorting was going to take a while. Hermione Granger went 2/3 of the way through the alphabet and sat under the hat for 11 seconds before Gryffindor, and the table in red and gold erupted with welcoming noise, and Hermione walked to it looking carefully composed and deeply relieved. She sat down and immediately turned to look back at Harry across the hall, and he gave her a small nod that he meant as I'll be over there shortly, and she seemed to receive it correctly. Neville Longbottom took almost 30 seconds and came out Gryffindor with an expression of mild shock, like a man who has jumped from a height and landed safely and isn't entirely sure how. Draco Malfoy sat down. The hat touched his head. The hat said Slytherin before the word barely could even apply. It was instantaneous, almost preemptive, as if the hat had known before Malfoy sat that the answer was obvious. Malfoy walked to the Slytherin table with the composed satisfaction of someone whose prediction had been confirmed. He caught Harry's eye across the hall as he sat, and the look was assessing in a way Harry found interesting. Not triumph, not mockery, assessment. Ron Weasley went to Gryffindor with a visible exhale of relief, sat down, and turned immediately to the twin boys at the end of the table who were clearly his brothers, accepting their congratulations with the easy familiarity of someone surrounded by people who are genuinely glad for him. Harry watched this with a feeling he couldn't name immediately, and then named it. It looked like what a family was supposed to look like. Then McGonagall said, "Potter, Harry," and the hall went very quiet, not the ordinary quiet of attention, the particular silence that happens when everyone in a room draws breath at the same moment. Harry heard it happen, that collective intake, and then heard the whispers start the way a fire starts, small and then suddenly everywhere. Potter, did she say Potter? Harry Potter. He walked to the stool. He sat down. He kept his face completely neutral. The hat dropped over his eyes and the hall disappeared, replaced by close, warm darkness that smelled faintly of dust and age and something he couldn't categorize, something that might have been accumulated human thought if thoughts had a smell. Then the hat spoke. Not out loud inside his head, which he had been half expecting from Hermione's pre-trip reading aloud on the train, but the voice was not what he'd expected. It was old and curious and not unkind, but it had edges. "Well," said the hat. "This is unusual." Harry waited. "I have sorted a great many students. I have sorted the fearful and the brave and the ambitious and the clever, and I have sorted students who were all four simultaneously, and I have on rare occasions sorted students who were something the categories don't fully cover." A pause. "You are that last sort, young man, and what's more, you know it." "I know some things," Harry thought back at it. "You know considerably more than you did yesterday," the hat said, with what might have been dry humor. "The question I have is not what you are. The question is what you choose. What are the options?" "Don't be clever," said the hat. "You know the options. All four houses," Harry said. "Hufflepuff values loyalty and hard work, and you have both, but they are not what drives you. Ravenclaw values intelligence and learning, and your mind is exceptional, but again, not the core of you." Another pause longer. "Gryffindor would take you immediately. There's courage here that is quite striking, not the performing sort, the real sort, the kind that exists without an audience. Your mother's, if I'm being precise." Harry felt something tighten in his chest. "And Slytherin," the hat continued, more carefully, "values ambition, resourcefulness, the determination to succeed by whatever means are available. And there is that in you too, Mr. Potter. Quite a lot of it, actually. There is a mind in here that intends to understand the machinery of the world rather than simply inhabit it. There is a will that does not bend." "That sounds like both," Harry said. "It is both," the hat agreed. "Which is rare, which is interesting. Your father," it hesitated. "Which father?" Harry went very still. Or perhaps the stillness was what he already was. "Both of them," Harry thought. "Gryffindor's blood and Slytherin's mind," the hat said quietly, almost to itself. "And your mother's magic underneath it all, which is the part that makes you genuinely remarkable." A long pause. "I could put you in either. I want you to understand that. This is a genuine choice. Where the hat sorts is where the student belongs, but belonging is not always a single place." Then where Harry thought, "Will I do the most good?" This surprised the hat. He could feel it, a slight adjustment, like someone leaning back to look at something differently. "Most students ask where they'll be most comfortable, or where they'll be most powerful. You asked where you'll do the most good." "Yes," Harry said. "That," the hat said with something that sounded like genuine satisfaction, "is entirely your mother." Another pause, longer than any of the others. Harry sat in the warm dark and let the hat think, because he had nothing to add and he trusted the hat to reach the right conclusion. It had been doing this for 1,000 years, and the track record was, as far as he could tell, fairly solid. "Gryffindor," the hat said finally. "Not because you are only Gryffindor, but because Gryffindor is where the people you need are. And because, Mr. Potter, the thing that drives you above all the others, above the intelligence, above the ambition, above the strategic mind, is that you will not, under any circumstances, stand by while something wrong is happening and call it someone else's problem." "No," Harry agreed. "I won't." "Gryffindor." The hat shouted it out loud, and the Gryffindor table exploded. And Harry lifted the hat off his head and handed it back to McGonagall and walked to the table through noise so loud it had a physical quality, like walking through warm water. He sat down next to Hermione, who was beaming, and across from Ron, who immediately said, "Brilliant, I knew it," with the confident tone of someone who had not known it at all but was glad to have been right. Harry glanced once at the teacher's table. Snape was looking at him with that same careful, controlled attention. His face was exactly neutral, but his hands, Harry noticed, resting on the table in front of him, were very still in the way that stillness is a choice rather than a default. Harry turned back to the Gryffindor table and reached for a bread roll and let himself be swept up in the noise of it, in the warmth of the great hall, in Hermione explaining something to Ron that Ron was pretending to understand, in the comfortable chaos of the feast appearing all at once on the tables with a collective gasp of startled delight from the first years who'd never seen it done. He ate. He listened. He watched everything. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. He made it until the third day before potions. The first day was mostly getting lost, which Harry found interesting rather than stressful. The castle rearranged itself in ways that the map in his head, built from reading, hadn't anticipated, and he'd updated the map as he went. He was late to Transfiguration because a staircase moved, which seemed like a design flaw, but McGonagall looked at him when he arrived not with anger, but with the particular expression of someone testing whether the student would make excuses. And Harry simply said, "The north staircase moved," with no apology in it, just information. And McGonagall had looked at him for 1 second longer than necessary before saying, "Sit down, Mr. Potter." McGonagall turned herself into a cat and back again in front of them. And Harry, who had spent a month with the Transfiguration textbook, understood immediately how she'd done it, not the specific mechanics of animagus transformation, which was far beyond anything he was going to attempt this year, but the underlying principle, the compression and expansion of magical intention that the textbook described as the fundamental act of all transfiguration. He raised his hand before she finished explaining and asked whether the intention or the wand movement was the primary driver when working on inorganic objects, and McGonagall stopped mid-sentence and looked at him with an expression that was carefully managed surprise. "The intention," she said. "Though both matter. Why do you ask?" "Because Bagshot suggests intention is primary, but the standard textbook emphasizes wand movement, and they can't both be right at the beginner level." "They can both be right," McGonagall said, "and the reason they appear to contradict each other is—" and she stopped again, this time looking at him with something more open. "Where did you read Bagshot?" "I bought a copy in Diagon Alley, the full edition, not the introductory one." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, carefully, "Stay after class." After class, she gave him the names of 3 books that were not on any of the assigned reading lists, which he took as the highest form of compliment she was capable of delivering. Charms was pure pleasure. Professor Flitwick was a small, enthusiastic man who taught with the joy of someone who has genuinely never stopped finding magic extraordinary. And Harry responded to that the way a plant responds to sunlight, instinctively, completely. He got the wrist motion for the basic levitation charm on his second try. By the end of the class, he was doing it one-handed. Flitwick asked to see it done again and watched with his head tilted and said, very quietly, "Remarkable control for someone who's never been formally trained." "I've practiced," Harry said, which was true. He'd spent the last month practicing every motion he could safely do in the cupboard without producing visible magical effects. "It shows," Flitwick said with evident pleasure, "but potions." Potions was Thursday morning, and the dungeons had a particular quality of cold that was different from the castle's general stoniness, a cold that lived in the walls and rose from the floor, a cold that suggested considerable depths below. The classroom itself was as the textbooks had described it: long stone tables, shelves of ingredients along the walls, the particular smell of a room where complex chemical processes had been happening for a very long time. Harry sat with Hermione at the second table. Ron was half a step behind them, still slightly confused about the layout of the dungeons, and sat on Harry's other side with the expression of a man who is not entirely comfortable with his surroundings, but is doing his best. He could feel the other first-years filing in around them. He could feel the cold in the floor through his shoes. He could feel his own heartbeat, which was steady, not because he wasn't feeling something, but because the something he was feeling was not fear. It was the particular heightened attention that comes before something important. The door opened. Snape entered the way Harry had the impression he always entered, without announcement, without preamble, crossing to the front of the room with the economical movement of someone who does not expend energy on anything unnecessary. His robes were dark and exactly right for the dungeons, like he'd been made for this room and the room had been made for him. He did not look at Harry when he came in. He took register, called names with the flat precision of someone to whom names are data, not performance. When he reached Potter Harry, he paused for 1/2 beat shorter than a full beat, and his voice, calling the name, was completely ordinary, completely level. "Here," Harry said. Snape looked at him then, just a look, quick, direct, and then past him. "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making," Snape said, and his voice in the classroom was a different instrument from the letter. It was quieter, more controlled, the kind of quiet that requires attention rather than demanding it. Harry understood immediately why the man was effective. Half the room leaned in. "As there is little foolish wand-waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic." A pause. "I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stop or death, if you aren't as big a group of dunderheads as I usually have to teach." Hermione's hand went up immediately. Snape looked at her for one moment. "I haven't asked the question, Miss Granger." Her hand went down. "Potter." The name landed differently when he used it as a direct address. It had a weight to it, a precision. "Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry had read this. Not in a textbook, in the comprehensive potions volume he'd found in a second-hand section of Flourish, and blots the day he'd gone back to Diagon Alley for forgotten supplies. He'd read it the way he read everything, thoroughly, and with attention to what was not being said as much as what was. "Draught of living death," Harry said. "It's a powerful sleeping potion, classified XXXXX in the standard ingredient taxonomy because the component interaction is irreversible if the quantities are wrong." The room was very quiet. Snape looked at him for 2 full seconds, not the flash look from the register, a real look, the kind that takes something apart to examine its components. "Where would I look if I wanted to find a bezoar?" he said, and his voice had not changed at all. "Stomach of a goat. It's a general antidote against most poisons, though it doesn't work universally. It fails against anything potassium-based and anything that disrupts at the cellular rather than the blood level." Another pause. Hermione, Harry noticed in his peripheral vision, had her hand up again, vibrating slightly. "What is the difference?" Snape said, and now there was something in his voice, not warmth, not anything that obvious, but a kind of careful attention that hadn't been there a moment ago, between monkshood and wolfsbane. "The same plant with 2 different names," Harry said, "also called aconite. It's used in the wolfsbane potion at specific lunar intervals, which was only formally developed in the last 30 years. Before that it was primarily a poison with no practical potion application." The room was so quiet he could hear someone's quill tap against their parchment. Snape clasped his hands behind his back and looked at Harry for a moment longer, and then he said, without emphasis, 5 points to Gryffindor. And then immediately to the class at large, "Why aren't any of the rest of you writing this down?" which shattered the silence into the scramble of 15 students grabbing quills simultaneously. Harry did not smile. He thought about it and decided not to, because smiling would perform something, and he wasn't performing. He was paying attention. For the rest of the class, Snape taught with the controlled precision of someone who is very good at a thing, and has made their peace with the fact that most students will not rise to meet it. He moved along the tables and looked at cauldrons and corrected with a word or two and occasionally a full sentence when the mistake warranted it. And Harry watched him the way he'd been watching everything at Hogwarts, with the particular attention he gave to things that contained more information than they appeared to. What he saw was this: Snape was not a cruel teacher. He was a demanding one, which was different. He said things that landed hard occasionally, but they were accurate, and accuracy applied to something you'd gotten wrong was a more useful gift than kindness applied to the same mistake. Harry understood this, had understood it abstractly from the textbooks, and now understood it concretely from watching the man work. Snape came to their table. He looked at Ron's cauldron first. Ron had managed to get the consistency approximately right, if not precisely, and Snape looked at it in silence for a moment before moving on. He looked at Hermione's, which was exactly right, and nodded once in a way that was not particularly generous but wasn't nothing. He looked at Harry's. Harry had followed the instructions to the letter and then made one adjustment, a temperature reduction in the third step, which the textbook hadn't specified, but which the underlying chemistry suggested was optimal for preventing the ingredient degradation that the textbook described as a common beginner error. Snape looked at it for longer than he'd looked at anyone else's. "You altered the temperature in the third phase," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation. The standard temperature causes partial degradation in the third ingredient before it can bind properly," Harry said. "The instructions don't mention it, but the outcome is improved at a lower heat." "Where did you read that?" "I extrapolated it from the ingredient properties." Snape looked at him, really looked at him directly, and this time neither of them performed anything. It lasted 3 seconds, which in a classroom is a very long time. "You extrapolated correctly," Snape said. 7 points to Gryffindor." He moved on immediately to the next table and Neville Longbottom's cauldron, which appeared to have developed structural concerns. Hermione leaned toward Harry slightly. "He's never given 7 points at once before," she whispered. "I asked the older students." "He gives points for correct answers," Harry said quietly. "He never gives points full stop," Hermione said. The older students were very clear about that. Harry didn't respond to this. He looked down at his cauldron and stirred it twice and thought about his father standing in a dungeon classroom for 10 years, being difficult on purpose, and doing it with such precision that no one could quite put their finger on the source of the difficulty. He found his opportunity 2 weeks in. He'd been looking for it without urgency. The way you look for the right moment to say something important, not forcing it, not manufacturing it, but recognizing it when it arrived. It arrived on a Tuesday evening when Harry was in the library later than everyone else, tracking down a reference Flitwick had mentioned in passing that none of the assigned texts covered. He was in the restricted section adjacent corridor, not the section itself, but close enough to smell the different quality of the books there, something older and more concentrated, when he heard footsteps that he recognized by now from 3 weeks of listening. Snape moved differently from the other professors. Quieter. More deliberate. The kind of footsteps that were the result of long practice in not being heard. Harry was sitting at a table with 4 books open around him, and he watched Snape come around the corner and stop when he saw him and said, "Professor." Snape looked at the books arranged around him, then at Harry. "It's 8:45. "The library closes at 9, Harry said. A pause. Snape looked at the books again, registering the titles Harry suspected with the same speed Harry used. His eyes paused on one. "Principles of Advanced Magical Theory is not a first-year text." "I know." "Flitwick mentioned it. I found a copy." Another pause. Snape said, with perfect neutrality, "You should be heading back to the tower before curfew." "I wanted to talk to you," Harry said, "and this seemed like as good a moment as any." Something shifted in Snape's posture, almost nothing, just a slight adjustment, the kind of shift that happens when someone who was prepared for one thing has to prepare for another. He said, "Mr. Potter, I read the letter," Harry said. "I drank the memory. I watched the whole thing." The library was very quiet. Somewhere in the stacks a book rustled on its shelf. The lamp on Harry's table threw warm, unsteady light, and in it Snape's face was doing the thing Harry had started to understand it did when something had gotten past the armor, not displaying an emotion exactly, but momentarily failing to display none. "I see," Snape said. "I'm not angry," Harry said. "I thought I should tell you that since you seem to be waiting to find out." Snape moved to the table. He didn't sit. He stood on the other side of it with his hands clasped behind his back, which Harry had identified as his default posture, the physical configuration of someone managing something carefully. "I wasn't waiting to find out," Snape said. "I was waiting for you to decide how you wanted to handle it." "I've decided," Harry said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know. I'm not going to tell Dumbledore. I'm not going to make things difficult for you." He paused. "But I'm not going to pretend either. So if you need me to act like I don't know who you are, that's not going to work." Snape looked at him for a long moment. "You look like your mother," he said, and it came out entirely unguarded, like something that had been waiting a long time to leave, and had finally found the gap in the wall. "I've been told I look like my father," Harry said, and meant James Potter, and then heard the echo of the sentence and understood that it meant something else now, and they both heard it. The corner of Snape's mouth moved, the smallest possible movement. "James Potter had atrocious hair," he said. "You have better hair." "It's still fairly bad," Harry said. "It is," Snape agreed. They looked at each other for a moment with the particular quality of two people who have just found common ground in an unexpected place. "What do you want from this?" Snape asked. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the classroom register. "I want to understand what you're asking for." "I don't know yet," Harry said honestly. "I've had 3 weeks to think about it and I don't have a complete answer, but I know I'm not going to treat you like a stranger just because it would be more convenient." He paused. "What do you want?" The question seemed to arrive like something Snape had not prepared for. He was quiet for long enough that Harry thought he might not answer. "I want," Snape started, then stopped. Then carefully, "I spent 11 years wanting things I couldn't have. I've become very practiced at not wanting." He looked at Harry with those very dark, very direct eyes. "What I have is a son who is sitting in a library at 8:45 reading materials 3 years above his level, which is extremely inconvenient and also exactly what I would do." Harry held very still, because the thing in his chest was doing something complicated. "Right," Harry said. "Right," Snape said. "Professor," Harry said, "why is Quirrell nervous around you?" It was not the direction either of them had expected the conversation to go. But Harry had been watching Quirrell for 3 weeks, and the man's behavior around Snape was specific and patterned in a way that itched at him. Snape's expression shifted from whatever it had been holding into something sharper. "What makes you think he's nervous around me specifically?" "He watches you the way someone watches a threat they're hoping won't notice them. At meals, in the corridors, he tracks your position." Harry tilted his head slightly. "What's on the 3rd floor corridor?" Now Snape was looking at him with the full attention, the undivided and unguarded kind. "What do you know about the 3rd floor?" "Nothing specific." "Dumbledore told us not to go there at the start of term feast, and Dumbledore tells us not to do things for reasons, which means there's a reason, which means there's something they're worth protecting." Harry paused. "And Quirrell has been to the 3rd floor at least twice in the last 2 weeks. I saw him coming from that direction." Snape was very quiet. "Stay away from the 3rd floor," he said finally, and his voice had a quality Harry hadn't heard from him yet, not commanding, not professorial, concerned. "Why?" "Because I'm telling you to," Snape said, and then seemed to hear the inadequacy of that. Because there are things at Hogwarts this year that are being managed by people with more information than you have, and rushing toward them without that information would be brave and stupid, Harry said. Your words, Snape said. I'm not going to rush anywhere, Harry said. I'm not going to stop paying attention either. Snape looked at him for a long moment. No, he said slowly, I don't expect you will. Something moved in his expression, something that was almost, not quite, but almost the thing that people's faces do when they're proud of something they haven't earned the right to be proud of yet. Collect your books, Mr. Potter. Curfew in 10 minutes. Harry started stacking books. One more thing. Of course. The memory, Harry said. The last part of it. What you said to her, and then she stepped back. He kept his eyes on the books as he stacked them precisely. Was she all right, after, when she went back to James? Was she? He stopped because the question was bigger than he could finish without it becoming something embarrassing. Snape's voice when he answered was quieter than Harry had ever heard it. She loved your father, James Potter. She chose him before she knew about you, and she continued to choose him, and she was all right. A pause. She was happy, Harry. Whatever else is true, she was happy. Harry nodded. He finished stacking the books. He picked up his bag. Good night, Professor, he said. Good night, Snape said. And the absence of Mr. Potter at the end was the loudest thing in the library. Halloween arrived the way it always did at Hogwarts, gradually, and then all at once. The decorations appeared overnight. Hundreds of jack-o'-lanterns floating through the great hall at breakfast. The ghosts becoming more animated than usual, Professor Flitwick turning the suits of armor in the fourth-floor corridor into carved pumpkins that sang to each other in thin, reedy voices. The feast was promised to be spectacular, and the whole castle smelled of it from noon onward, which made afternoon lessons difficult for everyone except Harry, who was sitting through a double charm session and concentrating so completely on the 4-point wand movement that the food smells barely registered. He was close to something with the levitation charm. Not the basic version, he'd had that on the first day, but something beyond it. A kind of sustained directional control that Flitwick had mentioned once as an advanced application, and then moved on from. Harry had been working on it quietly for 2 weeks, practicing in the dormitory after lights out, and this afternoon in the lesson he'd felt the edge of it. Ron was struggling with the basic charm still, his feather bobbing erratically, and Hermione across the table had hers moving in smooth, controlled arcs, her face tight with concentration. Harry's feather was suspended at eye level, and he was pushing it slowly, deliberately, through a sequence of movements without using the wand as anything more than a focus point. Flitwick drifted past, stopped, and stared. Mr. Potter, he said, very quietly. Professor, are you directing it with the wand or with intention? Both, Harry said. Mostly intention. Flitwick watched for another moment. The wand is functioning as a focus, not a driver. Yes. Flitwick clasped his small hands together. That is a technique that most students don't access until their 4th or 5th year, if at all. He tilted his head. Did someone teach you this? I worked it out from what you said in the first lesson, Harry said, about intention being the primary driver. Flitwick beamed so widely his face barely contained it. 15 points to Gryffindor, he said, almost to himself, as if he were just noting it down rather than announcing it. Ron's feather hit him in the nose. Sorry, Ron said. That wasn't aimed at you. Hermione snorted before she could stop herself, and then looked mortified about it. And then Harry laughed, a genuine one, surprised out of him. And then all 3 of them were laughing, and Flitwick was walking away shaking his head with evident pleasure. It was almost 5 o'clock when Parvati Patil came running into the charms corridor, not into the classroom. It had just ended, but she came pelting around the corner and nearly crashed into them at full speed, and even before she spoke Harry could see that something was wrong from the particular quality of her panic. The girls' bathroom, she said. 2nd floor, there's a troll. For a half-second no one moved. Then Ron said, "A troll." And Hermione said, "Trolls can't get into Hogwarts, the wards." And then the alarm bells Harry had heard only twice before, during the evacuation drills in his first week, began to sound through the castle. In the corridor, students began to pour out of classrooms. Teachers appeared. Somewhere to their left, McGonagall was directing students back toward the houses with sharp, efficient authority. Quirrell came sprinting past toward the staff room with his turban askew, face the color of old parchment, shouting about a troll in the dungeon in a voice that was somewhat more theatrical than the situation seemed to require. Harry stood very still and thought. He looked at the direction Quirrell had come from. He thought about the third floor. He thought about a man watching another man the way a person watches a threat, tracking position. He thought about Snape moving through the castle this evening. He'd seen him heading toward the Great Hall only 20 minutes ago. "Where's Hermione?" Ron said suddenly, and they both looked around. Harry scanned the corridor. The crowd was thick and moving, students pressing toward stairs, teachers cutting through the flow, and he could not see Hermione. "She went to the bathroom," Ron said. "Before the last lesson. She said she was going to the bathroom. She doesn't know about the troll." "Second floor girls' bathroom," Harry said, and he was already moving. Harry, Ron was right behind him. They went against the flow, which was uncomfortable and briefly generated a protest from a prefect who pointed in the wrong direction and looked surprised when Harry went around him instead of stopping. Harry had the castle layout clear in his head. The second-floor bathroom was northeast of their current position, 2 staircases and a corridor, and most of the traffic was going the other way, so the path was relatively clear. He wasn't afraid. This was interesting, in a detached way, the absence of fear where it probably should have been. What he had instead was a kind of accelerated clarity, the world sharpening down to the immediate problem and its most direct solution. Find Hermione. Get her out. Simple. The troll was in the corridor outside the bathroom when they got there. Harry had read about mountain trolls, which was the only textbook preparation that could have been less adequate for the experience of actually seeing one. It was 12 feet tall. 12 feet was a number that looked very different on the page than it did when it was standing in a stone corridor 20 feet away from you and carrying a club the size of a tree trunk, and it smelled extraordinary in the worst possible sense. It hadn't seen them yet. It was occupied with the wall. "Hermione," Ron whispered, from inside the bathroom. "Hello. Is someone?" And then the troll turned at the sound and saw the bathroom door and went for it, and Harry moved. He crossed the corridor in 5 steps, wand out, and said, "Wingardium Leviosa," except he didn't say it like he'd said it in class. He said it the way Flitwick had described as possible but not expected of any first year, with the intention carrying most of the weight rather than the word, and the club left the troll's hand and went up. All the way up. To the ceiling. With considerably more force than levitating a feather. The troll looked at its hand, then at the ceiling, in apparent confusion. Harry threw the club sideways. It hit the far wall and came down with a crash that shook the floor, and the troll swung toward him, furious now, and stumbled, and Ron, who had run to the side and grabbed a waste bin off the wall, which Harry thought was extremely committed, hit the troll in the knee with it, which accomplished roughly nothing physically but annoyed it. The troll swung at Ron, missed, and took out a significant section of wall. The bathroom door opened. Hermione stood there, white-faced and absolutely rigid. "Run," Harry said. Hermione, run." She ran. She ran past the troll, which was still looking at where Ron had been, and Harry grabbed her arm as she passed him, and they went left, and Ron went right, and the troll was confused by this for exactly the 2 seconds they needed, and then all 3 of them were in the corridor and running, and behind them there was another crash as the troll found a wall it hadn't hit yet. McGonagall arrived at the end of the corridor at full speed, with Snape and Quirrell 2 steps behind her, and stopped dead when she saw 3 first years running toward her from the direction of what sounded like structural damage. "What," McGonagall said, "is the meaning of this?" Harry stopped, breathing hard. "Troll," he said, "in the corridor. It's contained for now. I knocked its club away and it's confused, but it'll find the bathroom again in about 30 seconds. McGonagall looked at him for 1 second with an expression that was entirely unreadable. Then she looked past them and said, very quietly, "Severus." Snape was already moving. He went past them without a word, drew his wand, and disappeared around the corner. What happened next was not something Harry could fully see. He was still in the side corridor with Ron and Hermione, but he heard it. A single incantation in Snape's voice, quiet and precise, and then a sound like something very heavy sitting down, and then silence. Quirrell, Harry noticed, had not moved from the end of the corridor. He was standing very still with his hands folded into his sleeves and his eyes slightly too bright, and he was watching the corner Snape had gone around with an expression that was not relief. Harry looked at Quirrell. Quirrell looked at Harry. Something moved in Quirrell's expression that was not nervousness and not surprise. It was something much older and more deliberate than either, moving behind his eyes like something looking out from a room you hadn't known was there. Then it was gone. Quirrell looked away. His hands trembled visibly and he said, "Oh my, oh dear," in his faint, stuttering voice and shuffled toward the corridor. Harry filed that away. Snape came back around the corner and looked at all 3 of them in turn. He looked longest at Harry. "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said, and her voice had the quality it had when she was deciding something, "you will explain to me precisely what happened." "We came to find Hermione," Harry said. "She didn't know about the troll. We got here before it got into the bathroom. I used Wingardium Leviosa to disarm it, and then we moved Hermione out of the corridor." "You used—" McGonagall stopped. "Wingardium Leviosa disarmed a 12-foot mountain troll. The club was heavier than a feather," Harry said, "but the principle is the same." McGonagall looked at Snape. Something passed between them in the glance, something that had the texture of confirmation rather than surprise. 5 points each to Gryffindor, McGonagall said, with the same precision she applied to everything, for sheer presence of mind. And 10 points from Gryffindor for the fact that being in this corridor in the first place was irresponsible, dangerous, and something you will never do again. She looked at all 3 of them. "Is that understood?" "Yes, Professor," they said, more or less simultaneously. "Go to the Great Hall. The feast will resume." They went. Behind them, Harry heard McGonagall say something low to Quirrell, and heard Quirrell's thin, deferential response, and heard nothing from Snape, which was its own kind of response. He looked back once. Snape was watching them go, and his face had the thing on it again, the thing that wasn't an expression exactly, but was the deliberate absence of one. Harry held his gaze for a second and then looked forward again. The 3 of them walked back toward the Great Hall without talking for a full minute. The castle's alarm had stopped. The other students were filtering back, the feast apparently resuming, the noise of it reaching them already. Then Hermione said, very quietly, "Thank you. You'd have done the same," Harry said. "I wouldn't have thought to disarm it," she said. "I'd have been trying to run past it." "You had the right instinct to come back out of the bathroom," Harry said. "That was fast thinking." She looked at him for a moment. "We're friends, aren't we?" she said, as if she were checking her working. "Yes," Harry said. "Obviously," Ron said from her other side. "Does this mean we're a trio now? Because I think it means we're a trio." "That's what friends means, Ron," Hermione said. But she was almost smiling, and Ron grinned. And Harry walked between them back toward the warmth and noise of the Great Hall, feeling the particular warmth of something that was not a cupboard, not a letter, not a memory in a vial, but real and immediate and completely his own. He thought briefly of Snape standing in the corridor with his wand raised, and his voice quiet and controlled, and his face showing absolutely nothing. He thought, "We are both, apparently, very good at this." And then the great hall doors opened and the smell of the feast hit them, and Ron said, "Finally, I'm starving." And Harry laughed and went in. Chapter 3. What the Dungeons Know. November came in like it meant it. The Scottish Highlands didn't do autumn the way England didn't do the gentle golden slide of it, the polite cooling of evenings, the leaves turning in a way that felt decorative. Scotland did autumn like a warning. The wind off the lake had teeth by the first week of November, and the sky above the castle went the particular gray of old iron, and the lake's surface stopped being glass, and started being something restless and dark that Harry found himself watching from the common room window in the evenings with a kind of respect. He liked it. He liked the castle in bad weather, the way it hunkered down around you, the fires in the common room going higher, the corridors smelling of warm stone, and the particular wool and parchment scent of students who'd been outside and come back in. He liked the way Hogwarts felt alive in the cold, like a creature that was most itself when the world outside was difficult. November also meant Quidditch. He'd been added to the Gryffindor team in October, after an incident with Neville's Remembrall that he did not regret, and that McGonagall had watched from a window above the courtyard, with an expression that suggested she very much wanted to be disapproving, and was finding it difficult. He'd caught the Remembrall at 50 feet on a broom he'd barely touched before, pulled out of the dive at the last possible moment with a naturalness that had surprised even him. He'd expected to be good at flying. The books suggested it was partly instinct, but the moment he'd been on the broom there'd been nothing tentative about it. It was simply right. His body understood it the way his mind understood potions theory, immediately, completely, without needing to be told why. Oliver Wood had nearly wept with relief at the sight of him in the air. Harry had thrown himself into Quidditch practice with the same intensity he threw himself into everything, which occasionally concerned Oliver, not because Harry wasn't good enough but because he was working on things that Oliver hadn't asked him to work on, refining movements that Oliver said were already fine, practicing catches that nobody was going to attempt at the first-year level. He was patient about it. Oliver was the captain and Harry respected that. But he also kept practicing. The first match was Gryffindor versus Slytherin in mid-November, and Hermione had spent 2 weeks building up to it with a combination of genuine enthusiasm for Harry's success and poorly concealed anxiety about the altitude. Ron had declared, with absolute certainty, that Gryffindor was going to destroy Slytherin, and had spent considerable time making this declaration to anyone who would listen, and several people who wouldn't. The morning of the match, Harry ate breakfast with his Nimbus 2000 leaning against the bench beside him, and felt the focused quiet that came before things that mattered, and looked across the great hall at the Slytherin table, where Malfoy was watching him with that particular assessing look Harry had come to recognize as meaning he was being evaluated. He nodded at Malfoy, who didn't nod back but who also didn't look away, which Harry had started to understand was its own kind of acknowledgement. He looked at the teacher's table. Snape was eating toast with the focused attention of someone who is concentrating on toast specifically to avoid concentrating on something else. He had his potions journal open beside his plate, which was not unusual, but the pages weren't turning. 3 weeks since the library. They'd had a rhythm since then, not warm, not anything that could be pointed at and named, but present. Snape was harder on Harry in class than on any other student, which was exactly what the letter had promised, and which Harry had discovered he didn't actually mind. Snape's corrections were precise and useful. The harshness had information in it. When Snape said, "That is incorrect, Potter, try again," what he meant was, "I know you can do better, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because you're who you are." Harry had developed a theory that Snape's bluntness was, in its own way, a form of respect. He hadn't shared this theory with Ron, who would have argued with it. He'd mentioned it to Hermione, who had looked thoughtful for a long moment and then said, "That might be the most charitable interpretation I've ever heard of someone being rude to you." "He's not rude," Harry said. "He called your potion an insult to the conceptual framework of brewing last Tuesday." And then spent 4 minutes explaining why, which was actually quite educational. Hermione had given him the look she reserved for things she wasn't sure she agreed with but couldn't find the specific counterargument for, and let it go. He hadn't told Ron or Hermione about Snape. He'd thought about it more than once, had felt the shape of the conversation in his head, Ron's reaction, probably loud and complicated and involving several references to the general awfulness of Slytherin, Hermione's reaction, probably the opposite, careful and systematic, and asking 17 follow-up questions in alphabetical order. He wasn't avoiding the conversation because he thought they'd respond badly. He was avoiding it because it still felt like something he needed to understand fully before he handed it to someone else to understand. Some things were yours to carry until you knew what they weighed. The Quidditch pitch was enormous and freezing and full of noise. Both sets of supporters had turned out in force. The Gryffindor stands in red and gold. The Slytherin stands in green and silver. And the Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw students distributed between them based on either general house preference or whoever they felt like supporting that morning. Harry mounted his broom in the November wind and felt it, the way the air moved differently at height, the way the broom responded to intention before it responded to physical movement, like it was reading him half a second ahead. He rose to his starting position and looked out over the pitch and the gray sky above it and felt absolutely calm. Madame Hooch blew her whistle and they went. Oliver had given him one instruction: don't get hit, find the snitch. Which Harry interpreted as, stay out of the main play, watch everything. He went high, higher than his position called for, up into the gray air above the action, where the wind was stronger and the noise from below thinned to something more abstract. He could see the whole pitch from here. He could see both chasers moving, could see the bludgers in their trajectories, could see the Slytherin seeker across the pitch watching him with professional wariness. He looked for the snitch for 30 seconds and didn't find it. He expanded his awareness, not a specific thing he'd been taught, but something that had developed over the last month of practice, a way of softening the focus so that movement in the peripheral became more apparent. The snitch didn't stay in one place. The snitch moved and then stopped, and in the moment it stopped it was indistinguishable from the air around it, but in the moment it moved it was not. There, 40 feet below him and to the left, level with the middle set of goalposts, gone again. There. He went for it. The Slytherin seeker saw him move and came across at an angle, which was tactically sound, cutting off the direct line rather than racing Harry for the snitch directly, where Harry's broom would be the advantage. Harry saw this and adjusted without thinking, dropping lower, pulling the broom into a trajectory that looked like it was abandoning the pursuit, and instead angling toward the goalposts. And the Slytherin seeker corrected again, and Harry had been counting on that correction. He pulled up and left in a motion that was 90% intention and 10% wand movement. He wasn't using his wand. He was using himself. The thing he'd felt the first time on the broom, the direct translation of will into motion, and the snitch was there, right there, glinting gold in the gray November light, and he closed his fist around it and heard the crowd before he heard anything else. 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Oliver Wood was making noises below that didn't sound quite human. Harry descended through the noise and landed, and let the celebration wash over him and shook hands with the Slytherin seeker, who was gracious about it in a tight, controlled way. And then Ron was there, and Hermione was there, and Fred and George Weasley were lifting him off the ground in a way that was well-intentioned and slightly alarming, and he let it all happen around him and smiled and meant it. He looked up once at the teacher's stands. Snape was on his feet. He was not cheering, that would have required a personality transplant, but he was standing, and for a moment, in the noise and the gold and the gray sky, his eyes found Harry's across the distance of the pitch, and he inclined his head. A small, precise, deliberate movement. Harry nodded back. That was enough. That was more than enough. It was a week after the match that Harry found himself in the dungeons at 11 o'clock at night, not because he'd planned to be there, but because the thing that had been building since Halloween had reached a critical mass that made sitting still in the dormitory impossible. He'd been watching Quirrell all month. Quietly. Systematically. The way he watched everything, with the particular patience of someone who'd learned early that if you waited long enough, things showed themselves. He'd positioned himself in sightlines at meals, in corridors between classes, near the library in evenings. He'd tracked patterns, and the pattern he'd found was not comfortable. Quirrell went to the third floor. Not casually, not in the wandering way a professor might take different routes through the castle. Deliberately. At specific intervals, roughly every 4 days, at times when the main corridor traffic was minimal. Harry had been there 3 times without going further than the top of the stairs, watching Quirrell disappear around the corner and reappear 20 minutes later with his turban slightly disheveled and his color slightly off. Tonight was different because tonight Harry had seen something else. He'd been coming back from the library, legitimate trip, McGonagall's reading list, when he'd seen Snape going into a classroom 2 floors below the 3rd floor corridor, and Quirrell following him, and then heard raised voices. Not clearly, just the texture of raised voices, Snape's controlled, low, pressing something, and Quirrell's thin and higher and defensive. He'd stood in the corridor and thought for 3 seconds and then sat down against the wall and waited. Quirrell had come out first, walking quickly, his hands doing the trembling thing that Harry had observed was sometimes genuine and sometimes performed. Then Snape, who stopped in the corridor doorway and looked after Quirrell with an expression Harry had never seen on him before, open concern. Not about Quirrell, about what Quirrell represented. Snape had looked up and seen Harry sitting against the wall. A long pause. "My office," Snape said. Now, Snape's office was in the dungeons, which Harry had never been to before. It was less gloomy than the classroom, different kind of room, walls lined with shelves of ingredients rather than textbook shelves, a desk that was functional and covered in papers, 2 chairs. It smelled of the same concentrated ingredient and old magic scent as the classroom, but more intensely, as if this was where potions actually lived rather than where they were merely taught. Snape closed the door. "You were listening," he said. "I was waiting," Harry said. "There's a difference." "I heard voices but not words." Snape looked at him. "What did you hear?" Enough to know you were pressing him about something and he didn't want to answer. Harry sat in one of the chairs without being invited. "It's about the 3rd floor." Snape was very still. "I've been watching him for 3 weeks," Harry said. "He goes to the 3rd floor every 4 days. He came back from it tonight and he was frightened, not of whatever is in there, but of being caught near it." He paused. "He's frightened of you knowing he's been there. Which means you're looking for evidence of something, and he knows you're looking." Snape sat down behind his desk with the careful deliberateness of someone buying time to think. "You've been watching Quirrell since Halloween," he said. A question. "Since before Halloween, since the 1st week of term. You told me you'd noticed his behavior around me. I told you he watched you like a threat. I didn't tell you I'd been cataloging it." Harry held his gaze. "I didn't think I had enough information to share. I do now." Snape looked at him for a long moment. The office was very quiet, the dungeon's particular silence that was thicker than ordinary silence, the weight of the stone above and around them, the sense of the castle's depth. "What do you think is on the 3rd floor?" Snape asked. "Something worth protecting, something that someone wanted hidden inside the most heavily warded magical institution in Britain." Harry thought about it. "Dumbledore moved something out of Gringotts in July. Hagrid told me. He said he'd done an errand for Dumbledore, picked something up from Vault 713. The break-in at Gringotts was reported in the Daily Prophet the same day Hagrid and I went to Diagon Alley. He let that sit for a moment. The vault was empty by the time the thieves got there. Dumbledore had already moved whatever was in it. Snape was looking at him with an expression that was several things at once, and Harry had gotten good enough at reading the micro-expressions below the surface of Snape's controlled face to identify most of them. There was calculation. There was something he thought might be alarm, carefully managed. And there was something else he hadn't seen from Snape before, something that required a moment to name. Respect. Real respect, the kind that arrives unwillingly. You worked out the Gringotts connection from Hagrid mentioning an errand, Snape said. Hagrid mentioned it incidentally. He didn't think it was important. Harry paused. What's in Vault 713? What did Dumbledore move? That, Snape said, is not something I'm going to tell you. Because you don't know or because you think I shouldn't know. Because knowing it would make you a target, Snape said with a bluntness that cut through the deflection Harry had been prepared for. There are people looking for what is in that vault, Harry. The fewer people who can confirm its location, the safer everyone who knows is. Harry considered this. It was a real reason, not a management reason. He'd learned to tell the difference. Is Quirrell working for one of them? He asked. Snape's silence was its own answer. Is he dangerous? Potentially. Snape picked up a quill from his desk, looked at it, set it down. I'm watching him. I have been since before term, and I need you, he paused as if the next word cost something, to trust me to handle this. I do trust you, Harry said. That's not the issue. Then what is the issue? The issue is that trusting you to handle something doesn't mean I stop paying attention to it. Those are two different things. He held Snape's gaze. I'm not going to stop watching Quirrell. I'm not going to go to the 3rd floor. But I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I know. Snape looked at him for what felt like a long time. You are, he said finally, with something that was not quite exasperation and not quite admiration, extraordinarily difficult. I've been told, Harry said. By whom? You twice, McGonagall once. The Sorting Hat implied it. Snape made a sound that was not a laugh, but that occupied some of the same territory. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the desk, and then he said, without looking up, if you observe anything that suggests immediate danger, anything that goes beyond what you've already told me, you come to me directly. Not Dumbledore, not McGonagall, me. Why not Dumbledore? Snape looked up. Because Dumbledore will use the information to set something up that he has already decided should happen, and the things he has decided should happen have a consistent tendency to put you in the center of them. His voice was very even. I would prefer to keep you out of the center of this particular thing. Harry sat with that. He thought about Lily Evans saying, without hesitation, he would use it. He thought about the Sorting Hat saying, Dumbledore is a great man and a good one, and he is also capable of loving you and using you simultaneously. Not the Sorting Hat. That was in the letter. He was attributing it correctly now to Snape's letter, to those words that had been written with a care that cost something. All right, Harry said. All right, Snape repeated as if testing the simplicity of it. I mean it, Harry said. I'll come to you first. Snape nodded. And then, as Harry moved to stand, your Quidditch flying. He said it as if he'd been deciding whether to say it and had arrived at the decision slightly against his own preference. The movement you used to misdirect Montague before catching the snitch. That was, he stopped, started again. That was not something a first year should be able to do on a broom they've had for 2 months. I spent a lot of time practicing, Harry said. It wasn't practice, Snape said. Or not entirely. That kind of spatial intuition doesn't come from practice. It comes from, he looked at the desk again. Your mother was an exceptional flyer. It was not considered one of her primary talents because she was so outstanding at everything else, but her aerial awareness was. He seemed to hear himself and stopped. Harry stayed very still, the way he'd learned to stay still in the moments when Snape was closer to honest than he'd planned to be. "Thank you," Harry said quietly. Snape looked up sharply as if he'd expected something else. "For telling me that," Harry said. "About her." Snape looked at him for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, "She would have been at every match. She would have been insufferably proud." Something in his face was very controlled and very deliberate and very human. "She would have also been terrified every time you went into a dive." "Good thing she'd have had company," Harry said. Snape made the not quite a laugh sound again and looked away. And Harry took that as his cue to stand and say good night and leave the dungeon office. And he walked back through the corridors toward Gryffindor Tower in the cold November dark, and felt the shape of something in his chest that he was only just beginning to have a word for. December arrived, and with it the strange, specific tension of end-of-term exams approaching, which Hermione greeted with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for this, and Harry greeted with quiet preparation, and Ron greeted with mounting dread that he tried to conceal behind increasingly elaborate predictions about the Cheshire Cannon's upcoming season. But it was early December that produced the event Harry hadn't anticipated. He'd been in the library on a Saturday morning, alone. Hermione was there too, but 3 aisles away, and by mutual unspoken agreement, they worked in the same space without necessarily working together, which was one of the things Harry liked best about her. Ron was at breakfast. The library was almost empty, the castle generally slow on Saturday mornings, and Harry had an advanced charm theory text open, and was working through the theory of transfiguration-adjacent spellwork, which occupied some interesting middle territory between 2 disciplines. He heard Quirrell before he saw him. Not his footsteps. Quirrell's footsteps were deliberately quiet in a way that went beyond ordinary library awareness. What Harry heard was the sound of a book being replaced on a shelf 2 aisles over with the careful precision of someone who did not want to be noticed handling it. Harry closed his own book quietly and listened. A pause. Another book. Then footsteps, moving away, toward the restricted section. Harry stood up and moved to the end of his aisle. From here he could see the approach to the restricted section, the rope across the entrance and the sign. He watched Quirrell, not looking at the rope, but standing near the shelves adjacent to it, running a finger along the spines of the books there. Apparently browsing, except his face was angled wrong for browsing. He was watching the librarian's desk, which was currently empty, Madame Pince having stepped out. Harry watched Quirrell take 3 books off the shelf and turn as if reading the titles. And then, in a movement that was so casual it would have been invisible to anyone not watching specifically for it, he unclipped the restricted section rope, stepped through, replaced it behind him, and was gone. Harry processed this for approximately 4 seconds. He crossed the library in 12 steps, reached the rope, looked at it. He did not unhook it. He thought about what Snape had said. "Come to me directly." He thought about Quirrell's face in the corridor on Halloween, the thing looking out from behind his eyes that was older and more deliberate than anything Quirrell's thin, nervous face should have been able to contain. He thought about what it meant that Quirrell needed to access the restricted section on a Saturday morning when the librarian had stepped away. He needed to know what Quirrell was looking for. He found a spot against the shelves with a sightline to the restricted section entrance and sat down on the floor with his own book open in his lap and waited. Quirrell emerged 8 minutes later with nothing visible in his hands, which meant whatever he'd found was either in his robes or committed to memory. He reclipped the rope. He straightened his turban. He left. Harry gave him 3 minutes and then went to the restricted section. He was aware this was technically against the rules. He was also aware that the rules were a framework for situations Madame Pince had anticipated, and Madame Pince had not anticipated this particular situation. He slipped under the rope, catalogued the shelves, and found the aisle where Quirrell had stood. He could tell by the slight displacement of dust and the angle of approach. 3 books had been removed and replaced. He could see the subtle difference. Books that had been taken off a shelf and put back weren't quite aligned in the same way as books that hadn't been touched. There was a fractional gap in the bottom edge. He pulled them out. Read the titles. One on defensive dark magic theory, which told him nothing. One on the history of cursed objects, which might have told him something if he had more context. And one that made him stop. Nicholas Flamel and the Philosopher's Stone, a history of alchemy's greatest achievement. He opened it, skimmed it. The book had been published 40 years ago and was dense with historical detail, and what it told him in the first 3 pages was this. The Philosopher's Stone was a legendary alchemical object capable of producing the elixir of life, which made the drinker immortal. There was only one known stone. It had been created by Nicholas Flamel, who was currently 665 years old and living in Devon. Harry put the books back. He slipped out of the restricted section. He walked back to his table, sat down, and stared at his charm theory text for a moment without reading it. The stone was what was on the 3rd floor. That was what Dumbledore had moved from Vault 713. And Quirrell was looking for information about it, which meant either he didn't know exactly what he was trying to steal, or he knew what he was trying to steal and was looking for the means to steal it. He thought about what was on the 3rd floor. Whatever Hagrid had mentioned, a nice little dragon, but that's between you and me. There was a 3-headed dog there. Harry had pieced this together from Hagrid's extremely poor attempts at discretion, and presumably other protections beneath it. A layered defense system designed by the best witches and wizards Dumbledore trusted, and Quirrell, with whatever was looking out from behind his eyes, was working toward getting through it. Harry closed his book. He was in Snape's office by noon. He laid it out systematically: the library, Quirrell, the restricted section, the books, the Philosopher's Stone. He did not dramatize any of it. He stated it as information, in order, the way he would state the steps of a potion. Snape listened without interrupting. This was one of the things Harry had come to rely on, Snape's capacity to listen to something fully before responding to it, which was rarer than it should have been in an adult. When Harry finished, Snape was quiet for a moment. "Flamel," he said. "You made the connection to Flamel. The book was obvious once I found it. He removed it from the restricted section, which means he was looking for information he didn't want logged." Snape stood up and went to his own shelves, pulled a small leather-bound volume, opened it with the rapid page-turning of someone who knows exactly where what they're looking for is. He looked at it for a moment and closed it. "You cannot tell anyone else what you just told me," Snape said. "Not Hermione Granger, not Weasley, not Dumbledore." "I know why not Dumbledore," Harry said. "Why not Hermione and Ron?" "Because knowing this puts them in danger," Snape said, and the simplicity of it was answer enough. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to increase my watch on Quirrell, and I'm going to speak to Dumbledore about the security arrangements, without telling him what you found, which will be a careful conversation." He looked at Harry directly. "And you are going to attend your classes and play Quidditch, and be 11 years old for the next 3 weeks until Christmas break." "I'm nearly 12, Harry said. "That doesn't help your argument." "I'm not arguing," Harry said. "I'm clarifying." He stood up. "I'll leave it with you, but you'll tell me if something changes. I'll tell you what you need to know when you need to know it." "That's not the same as what I just said." "No," Snape agreed with the tone of a man who has noticed the difference and chosen it deliberately. "It's not." Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "My mum said Dumbledore would use information to manage situations he'd already decided should happen." He paused. "You're doing something similar right now." Snape looked at him. Something moved in his expression. "The difference," Snape said carefully, "is that Dumbledore's decisions about what you need to know are based on what serves the greater good. Mine are based on what keeps you specifically safe." He held Harry's gaze. They can look the same from the outside. They are not the same. Harry thought about that. Okay, he said. Okay, Snape repeated with what might have been slight relief. I still think you should tell me more than you're planning to. I'm aware of your position. I just want to register it. Registered, Snape said. Good afternoon, Mr. Potter. Good afternoon, Harry said and left. He walked back through the dungeon corridor and up the stone stairs and into the warmer upper castle, and he thought about his mother saying he would use it and Snape saying mine are based on what keeps you specifically safe and the difference between those two things, which was real and important, and which he was going to need to keep holding clearly in his head as the year went on. He was not naive about Snape. He didn't think the man was without complexity or without the capacity to make choices Harry wouldn't agree with. He just also thought that whatever Snape was doing, he was doing it with his whole self in it, without the calculation of distance. Dumbledore loved from a remove. Snape, whatever else he was not capable of remove. It was perhaps his greatest flaw and his most important quality simultaneously. Harry stopped in a corridor on the third-floor landing, not at the corridor itself, just near the stairs that led toward it, and looked up at the ceiling of the castle above him, and thought about a philosopher's stone and a man with something living behind his eyes and a layered system of protections designed by the best magical minds in Britain. He thought about what the Sorting Hat had said. You will not, under any circumstances, stand by while something wrong is happening and call it someone else's problem. No, Harry said to the empty corridor. I won't. He turned away from the third-floor stairs and went back down. For now. The last week before Christmas break had a quality Harry would remember for the rest of his life. The specific texture of knowing something important and carrying it quietly while everything around you moved at its ordinary pace. The castle was decorated in the way that only Hogwarts managed, extravagant without being excessive, the kind of beauty that felt earned rather than performed. 12 Christmas trees in the Great Hall, suits of armor that sang carols, the grounds covered in snow that caught the light from the castle windows in the evening, and made the whole lake look like something from the kind of story Harry had not been allowed to read as a child. He sent Hedwig out with 3 letters. One to no one because there was no one outside Hogwarts to write to. 2 in the end, to people he hadn't planned on writing to. The first was to Hagrid, who had given him an album and a kindness, and who he had a feeling needed to hear from him. The second was shorter. He sat with it in the dormitory after the others had gone down, by the window with the snow outside and Hedwig waiting on her perch with the particular patience of an owl who knows she's about to work. He wrote, I thought you should know I'm all right. The term's gone well. I've been thinking about what you said in your letter about holding on to knowing I was alive. I want you to know I understand why you did what you did. I'm not certain yet what I think about all of it, but I don't hold it against you. He paused. I caught the snitch in 4 minutes in the first match. You should have been there. He considered whether to say the last part and then wrote it anyway. Maybe next term you will be. He gave the letter to Hedwig, and she looked at him with those amber eyes that always seemed to be reading something specific, and he scratched behind her ear, and she went out the window into the cold dark. He stayed at the window for a while and watched the snow come down and thought about a kitchen he'd never actually been in, warm and cluttered, and a woman with red hair and bright eyes holding a sleeping baby, while a man she trusted stood near the door and loved them both without a way to say it that didn't cost something enormous. He'd been carried all his life by things he hadn't known about. He'd been surrounded by love that had been forced into the shape of silence, and it had still gotten to him, through a letter, through a memory in a vial, through a man who was harder on him than on anyone else in a dungeon classroom, and meant something entirely different by it than the other students thought. He turned from the window. He went to bed and slept well and dreamed of flying. The night before the students left for Christmas, Harry was doing a last check of the common room to make sure he hadn't left any books. He'd become the person who went back for books, which Hermione found endearing and Ron found baffling, when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside the portrait hole, then a voice he recognized. Not Snape. Dumbledore. "I'm afraid I must ask you to leave the enchantments as they are for the remainder of the year, Severus." And Snape's voice, quiet and very controlled. "With respect, Headmaster, the current arrangement has a vulnerability that has been considered and accounted for," Dumbledore said with a warmth that was not unkind but was also not open to argument. "I appreciate your diligence, I always have." A pause. "Then, there are things in motion this year that I cannot fully explain. I ask for your trust as I have always asked for it." "You've always had it," Snape said, and then after a silence, "and if something goes wrong, then we respond to it," Dumbledore said simply. "As we always have." Footsteps. Moving away. Harry stood in the common room and stared at the portrait hole for a moment. Dumbledore knew something was wrong with the security. Snape had tried to tell him. Dumbledore had used warmth and trust and the particular authority of a man who has been right enough times that people give him the benefit of the doubt, and he'd closed the conversation. Harry thought, as if whatever was going to happen was something he'd already decided should be allowed to happen. The fire popped in the common room grate. Harry sat down in the chair nearest it and stared into the flames. He thought about what the year was moving toward. He thought about Quirrell and what was looking out from behind his eyes. He thought about a stone that could produce immortality and the person who'd once been immortal enough to kill his parents and had been reduced to something that needed a host body and a second chance. He thought, Dumbledore knows. He's letting it happen. He's built the whole situation as a test, or a trap, or both, and the bait is the stone, and whoever springs the trap is meant to be me. He sat with that for a long time. Then he thought about Snape, standing in the corridor outside, trying to prevent it, being managed and redirected with warmth and trust, and the immovable certainty of someone who had decided the outcome already. Harry looked at the fire. "Not on your timeline," he said very quietly. "Yours or anyone else's." The fire burned steadily. The castle was quiet around him, stone and snow and 10 generations of accumulated magic, and Harry Potter sat in the warmth of it and began, very quietly, to make his own plans. Chapter 4. The man behind the mirror. Christmas at Hogwarts was a different creature entirely from Christmas anywhere else Harry had ever been, which was not saying much since Christmas at the Dursleys had consisted of being handed a 50-pence piece and told not to touch Dudley's presents. But even measured against some imagined standard of what Christmas could be, Hogwarts in December was something else. He decided to stay. Most of Gryffindor went home. Ron stayed too, cheerfully, claiming his mother had sent so many food parcels that the trip home would have been redundant, which Harry suspected was not entirely the real reason but appreciated anyway. Hermione went home to her parents, and her departure from the platform had the particular quality of someone who loved 2 places and was having to choose between them on a deadline. And Harry had told her to go, obviously. Go, he'd be fine. And she'd hugged him with the sudden ferocity of someone who hadn't planned to, and then walked very quickly toward the carriages. The castle with its reduced population became a different space, quieter, the high ceilings somehow more audible, the corridors longer. Harry found he liked it even more this way. He could go where he wanted when he wanted, which meant he could think where he wanted, which was what he actually needed. He'd spent the first 2 days of the holiday just being. He ate at the small table McGonagall set up near the fire for the remaining students. He walked the grounds in the snow. He let himself be comfortable in a way that still took practice, that still had an unfamiliar texture, the way a new pair of shoes has before they've learned the specific shape of your foot. He was learning the shape of being cared for. It was slow work. On the third day, he woke early to a pile of Christmas presents at the foot of his bed that was 3 times the size of anything he'd expected, and sat up in the thin gray light and looked at them for a moment before moving. A jumper from Mrs. Weasley, hand-knitted, deep green, with a small golden snitch on the chest that actually moved, flickering across the wool in a way that should have been technically impossible, and was instead simply warm and extraordinary. He put it on immediately and felt something that had a texture he didn't have an exact word for yet, but which was somewhere between gratitude and the specific ache of wanting something for a long time without knowing it and then having it. A box of every flavor beans from Ron. A book from Hermione on advanced charm theory, the specific volume he'd mentioned wanting, with a note inside that said, "I looked for it in 5 shops. Don't tell me the present is too expensive. It isn't." He smiled at this because it was so precisely her, the preemptive counterargument, the covering of all angles. There was a package wrapped in plain brown paper with no card. Inside was a cloak, not a school robe, not anything with a house color, something else. Something that caught the light wrong, that moved when he lifted it in a way that didn't quite resolve into the folds of ordinary fabric. He put it over his hand and watched his hand disappear. An invisibility cloak. There was a piece of parchment folded inside the wrapping. Just one line in handwriting he didn't recognize, not Snape's controlled precision, not anything he'd seen before. "Your father left this in my possession. It is time it was returned to you." No signature. Harry sat with the cloak in his hands for a long time. He thought about James Potter, who had been his father in the way that mattered for 10 years of grief and myth, and the shape of a story. He thought about the fact that Snape had given him a memory and a letter, and said, "You are more than the boy who lived." And James Potter had left him an invisibility cloak, and apparently no note at all, because that was the kind of man James Potter seemed to have been. Grand gestures without the accompanying explanation, which let other people fill in what the gesture meant. He draped it over his shoulders. He looked down and saw nothing below his neck. He folded it carefully and put it at the bottom of his trunk and then went down for Christmas breakfast, wearing the green jumper with the moving snitch. And Ron looked at it and said, "She sends everyone jumpers," with the tone of someone who is deeply fond of something they've received enough times to be slightly exasperated by it. And Harry thought that was an extraordinarily good problem to have. It was the 5th night of the holidays when he used the cloak. He hadn't planned a specific destination. He'd told himself he was going to explore, which was true, and that the cloak was purely a practical tool for doing so without getting caught after curfew, which was also true and also not the whole truth. What he wanted was to move through the castle without being seen, which was different from exploring. Exploring was outward. This was inward. He wanted to see the castle without the castle performing for him, without it knowing he was there. He went down through Gryffindor Tower and out through corridors he knew well, and then through ones he knew less well. The parts of the castle that didn't come up in the standard route between classes and common room and library. The castle at 1 in the morning had a different quality, the portraits sleeping in their frames, the suits of armor still, the normal sounds of movement replaced by something deeper. The actual sound of the building, the groan and tick of very old stone that had absorbed centuries of warmth and weather, and the accumulated energy of magic being practiced within it. He found the room on the 5th floor without intending to. He'd been turning down an unused corridor, one of the ones the castle occasionally produced that felt more like memory than active architecture, corridors that existed because the castle had decided they should rather than because there was somewhere specific they needed to go. The door at the end was unremarkable, old, wooden, slightly warped in its frame. It was ajar. Harry pushed it open. The room inside was empty of furniture except for the mirror. It stood against the far wall with the absolute self-possession of something that has always been in exactly this place, and expects to continue to be. It was enormous, taller than two men, wider than the arm span suggested by the ornate gold frame around it. Across the top of the frame, a script ran in letters that Harry tilted his head to read. Eris stra eru oit ube kafru oit on wosi. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the mirror looking back at him, and then he walked in. He saw himself first, the way you always do with mirrors, his own reflection, the green jumper, the familiar disarray of his hair. And then the reflection moved in a way his reflection shouldn't, and other figures came into it, surrounding him, filling the mirror with a depth it shouldn't have had given that there was only stone wall behind it. He'd expected his parents. He'd been told the mirror showed you your heart's deepest desire, and he'd assumed, reasonably, that the thing he most wanted was what everyone told him he most wanted, his family, his mother, the life that had been taken from him. He'd expected Lily Evans's red hair and James Potter's face. What the mirror showed him was different. Beside his reflection stood Snape, not the Snape of classrooms and dungeons and careful, controlled expressions, but something more complete. The armor still there, but not the only thing. A figure that stood beside Harry's reflection with the unconscious ease of someone who belongs exactly where they are. And beside Snape, half a step back but present, unmistakably present, was a woman with bright eyes and red hair that Harry knew from photographs and had watched move in a memory in a vial on the night everything changed. His mother was laughing at something Snape had said, and Harry in the mirror was watching them both with the expression of someone who has everything they need. That wasn't the thing that stopped him cold, though. What stopped him cold was what mirror Harry was holding. Not a trophy, not the stone, not anything the books would have predicted. His reflection was holding a roll of parchment, and even though he couldn't read the writing from this distance, he understood, in the inexplicable way of mirrors that show you the truth without translation, that it was something simple. Not a letter about secrets or a memory in a vial. Just a letter. The kind that exists between people who don't need to explain the extraordinary because they've already agreed that it's real. He stood in front of the mirror for a long time. He didn't move toward it. He understood instinctively from Bagshot, from the charm theory, from the way all magic that showed you something true always carried an equivalent warning, that the mirror was a seduction as much as a revelation. The showing was not the having. He was looking at what he wanted. He was going to look at it fully, and then he was going to turn around. He wanted a family. Not the idea of one, not the shape of one from a distance, but the actual daily fact of one, people who were his, and who he was theirs in the ordinary, unremarkable way that Ron could be dismissive about Mrs. Weasley's jumpers. He wanted to write a letter and have it be a normal letter, not a secret, not carefully worded to conceal the nature of the thing it was documenting. He wanted Snape to be able to stand next to him in a corridor without it being a performance of not caring. He wanted his mother, who had been dead for 10 years, to laugh at something. He looked at this for exactly as long as he needed to. Then he turned away from the mirror and walked back toward the door. Behind him, the mirror reflected an empty room. He was in the corridor outside, cloak on, when he heard footsteps. Not distant footsteps, close, deliberate, the kind that suggested someone who knew this part of the castle and had a reason to be here. He went still against the wall and waited. Dumbledore appeared at the end of the corridor. He was wearing deep blue robes and an expression that was entirely serene, and he walked toward the door of the mirror room with the unhurried certainty of someone who had expected to find what they were going to find. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the mirror for a moment. He looked at the room. He turned, very slowly, and looked directly at the section of corridor where Harry was standing. "I expect," Dumbledore said pleasantly, as if continuing a conversation already in progress, "that an invisible person might want to come out now." Harry considered his options for 2 seconds. Then he pulled the cloak off. Dumbledore looked at him without surprise, which was itself a kind of confirmation. He'd known Harry was here, or had strongly suspected it, which meant he knew about the cloak, had probably known it would be used, had probably anticipated this. "Harry," Dumbledore said, with the warmth that was real and also, Harry now understood, a deliberate instrument. "You found the mirror of Arist." "I found the room," Harry said. "The mirror found me." Dumbledore's eyes did their twinkling thing, which Harry had previously found comforting and now found interesting in a different way. "It shows us what we most deeply desire. Do you know what you saw?" "Yes," Harry said. A pause. Dumbledore waited for him to elaborate, and Harry didn't. "Most men," Dumbledore said gently, "see themselves possessed of things they most desire. Wealth, power, loved ones. What did you see, Harry, in the mirror?" Harry looked at him for a moment. He understood what was happening. Dumbledore wanted the information. Not maliciously. Not even manipulatively, exactly. He wanted it the way a man who has been managing a very complex situation wants data points. He wanted to know what Harry's heart was doing, because Harry's heart was relevant to what Dumbledore had planned. "I saw myself," Harry said, "with people I care about, in ordinary circumstances." Dumbledore looked at him steadily. "And which people were these?" "My mother," Harry said. This was true and complete and gave Dumbledore nothing specific. A pause. Something moved behind Dumbledore's eyes, not quite satisfaction, not quite disappointment. The assessment of someone who expected more information and is recalibrating. "The happiest man alive," Dumbledore said, "would look in this mirror and see only himself, exactly as he is." A pause. "The mirror gives us neither knowledge nor truth. Men have wasted away in front of it, lost in what they have seen. It does not do to dwell in dreams, Harry, and forget to live." "I wasn't dwelling," Harry said. "I looked at it and I left." Dumbledore looked at him with something that shifted slightly in its quality, a new attention, a slight recalibration. "Did you?" "Yes." "And you weren't tempted to stay?" "I was tempted," Harry said. "That's different from staying." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The corridor was very still around them, the particular stillness of two people having a conversation that is about more than what is being said. "You are," Dumbledore said, and his voice had something new in it, something more direct than the warm, avuncular register he usually inhabited. "A remarkable young man, Harry. More remarkable, I think, than even I anticipated." "What did you anticipate?" Harry asked. The question landed in the silence between them. Harry kept his face open and curious, not challenging. He'd learned that direct challenge put people on the defensive, and defensive people closed up. Open curiosity made them explain themselves. "I anticipated," Dumbledore began, and then stopped, and what happened on his face in the gap of the stop was small but important. He looked at Harry, really looked, and behind the warmth and the wisdom and the careful performance of benign authority was something more complex and more human. A man who had made very large decisions about a very small child and was, for the first time, looking at the results of those decisions face to face. "I anticipated a boy," Dumbledore said finally, "who would need guidance." "I do need guidance," Harry said. "Everyone does. That's not the same as needing to be managed." The silence that followed was the loudest Harry had produced in months. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and behind the twinkle something measured and serious worked itself out. "Who told you about the third-floor corridor?" he asked, quietly, with the precision of someone who has been waiting to ask. "I noticed the prohibition at the start of term feast," Harry said, "and I'm observant." "You are that," Dumbledore agreed. Another pause, and Severus, "has he discussed the matter with you?" "Professor Snape has been very professional," Harry said, which was accurate without being informative. Dumbledore studied him. It was a different kind of look than Harry was used to getting from adults. Not the trying to find what's wrong look he'd gotten from Dursleys. Not the assessing what he can do look he got from teachers. This was the look of someone trying to read something that was not quite in a language they expected. "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice gentled, "I want you to trust me." "I do trust you," Harry said, and then carefully, "I also pay attention." "And what has paying attention told you?" "That Hogwarts is not entirely safe this year," Harry said. "That there's something on the third floor that someone wants very badly. That the someone in question is not operating alone." He paused. "And that you know all of this." Dumbledore was very still. "I think," Harry said, and his voice was quiet and completely steady, "that you've built something that you expect to be broken into. And I think you've thought about what happens after it's broken into. And I think your plan involves me because your plans generally seem to." The corridor held the weight of that for a long moment. Dumbledore said, with a care and a gentleness that was entirely real, "I would not put you in a position of danger without believing you could survive it." "I know," Harry said. "That's not the part that concerns me." "What concerns you?" "That surviving it is the plan," Harry said, "not preventing it." Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but genuinely. Harry thought this might be the first time he'd said something that actually moved something in Dumbledore rather than merely being processed by him. "You are," Dumbledore said softly, "very much like your mother." "I've been told," Harry said, "by someone who knew her." The tiniest pause. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "She was also impossible to manage once she'd made up her mind about something." "Did you try?" Harry asked. "Frequently," Dumbledore said, and there was something in it that was almost rueful, almost honest. "She was usually right. It was extremely inconvenient." Harry almost smiled. "Almost." "I'm going to bed," Harry said. "Good night, Professor." "Good night, Harry." A pause. "The mirror will be moved tomorrow. It is best not to look into it again." "I wasn't planning to," Harry said. "I saw what I needed to." He walked back down the corridor toward Gryffindor Tower, and he didn't look back, and he felt Dumbledore watching him go until he turned the corner. January arrived with the other students and new urgency. Hermione came back from the holidays with 4 new books she hadn't been assigned, and the specific energy of someone who'd spent 2 weeks being slightly bored and was now channeling 2 weeks of boredom into focused activity. Ron came back with chocolate from his mother and stories about his brothers that Harry listened to with the particular quality of attention. He gave things that showed him how families actually functioned, filing away the details. The way the twins finished each other's sentences. The way Bill apparently sent letters that made Mrs. Weasley cry with pride. The way Percy was taking his prefect position so seriously it had become a family running joke. Harry listened to all of it and thought about what it meant to have a history with people. To have a long enough shared context that the shorthand worked, where a single word or reference opened up a whole room of shared meaning. He'd never had that with anyone, and now he had the beginning of it with Hermione and Ron, and it was still tender and new, and he paid it careful attention. He told them about the mirror the second day back. Not about what he'd seen in it, that part was still his, but about finding it, and about the conversation with Dumbledore. They were in the common room after dinner, the 3 of them in the chairs by the fire, the castle dark outside the windows, and he laid it out plainly. The room, the mirror, Dumbledore appearing, the conversation that had followed. Hermione had her thinking face on before he was halfway through. Ron's was the expression of someone absorbing several alarming things simultaneously. "He said he anticipated needing to guide you," Hermione said when he finished. "And then you suggested he'd built a trap and he didn't deny it." "He redirected," Harry said, "which isn't the same as denying." "The stone," Hermione said. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who has been turning a puzzle over for weeks and just found the final piece. "Nicholas Flamel." Harry looked at her. "I found it in great wizarding events of the 20th century," she said, a little defensively, as if she expected him to question the source. and in notable magical names of our time. And the library has a reference, she stopped. You already knew. Since before Christmas, Harry said. Ron said, hang on, what? They explained it to him, the stone, flame, the vault at Gringotts, the logic of what was on the third floor. Ron listened with full attention, which Harry had come to recognize was something Ron did completely when something mattered. He wasn't half listening, he was in it. So Quirrell is trying to steal it, Ron said. For you know who. For someone, Harry said. Presumably. Right, so what do? We keep watching, Harry said, and we don't do anything that puts Quirrell on alert. Hermione said carefully, what did Snape say? When you told him about the library? Harry had told them after the holidays that he'd had a conversation with Snape about Quirrell, not the full context of why, not the reason the conversation had been possible in the first place, but the fact of it. Hermione had noted this at the time with the careful neutrality of someone storing it for later consideration. He said he was handling it, Harry said. And you believe him? I believe he's trying to, Harry said. I think Dumbledore is limiting what he can do. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Ron looked between them both with the expression of someone who has followed the logic and doesn't love where it's gone. So Dumbledore is limiting Snape's ability to stop Quirrell, Hermione said, because Dumbledore wants whatever is going to happen. Yes, Harry said, and the thing that's supposed to happen involves you. Presumably, Ron said flatly. That's not right. No, Harry agreed. So we prepare, Ron said, with the simplicity of someone for whom the logical chain between that's wrong and therefore we act requires no intermediate steps. Harry found this extraordinarily useful. We prepare, Harry agreed. February and March had the quality of a season sharpening. Harry drove himself harder in every subject. Not frantically, not the white-knuckled cramming style of a student who's afraid, but the sustained methodical expansion of someone who is doing it on purpose. He went further in charms than the syllabus required, which Flitwick encouraged with visible delight, giving him 2 supplementary texts and clearing out Thursday afternoons for independent work that the little professor supervised with the focused joy of someone discovering that one student in a generation is genuinely going to do something exceptional. Transfiguration with McGonagall became a different kind of challenge. She was tougher on him than on the other students in the way Snape was, but McGonagall's toughness was more open about itself. She told him directly when she expected more and why, which he respected. In February, she handed him a theoretical paper on the limits of human transfiguration that was 4 years beyond the curriculum and said, "Tell me what you think is wrong with the argument in Section 3, and walked away. And Harry had read it 3 times and written 4 pages of response, and she'd read them in class with a stillness that meant she was taking it seriously. The only one she showed it to after class was Flitwick, which Harry learned from Flitwick himself, who mentioned it with unconcealed pleasure. Potions continued as it had been, Snape demanding, Harry meeting the demands, a rhythm that had settled into something that functioned on 2 levels simultaneously. On the surface level, Snape was hard on him, harder than on anyone, and the class watched for signs of favoritism and found none, and the other Slytherins interpreted this as Snape simply disliking Potter extra, which worked fine. On the level below that, in the particular quality of the corrections and the way they were delivered, Harry could read something else entirely, the specific sharpness of someone who knows exactly what the student under their eye is capable of, and refuses to let them settle for less. Neville Longbottom was having a harder time than anyone. The poor boy was terrified of Snape in a way that had a specific quality to it, a quality that Harry had started to suspect had a history he didn't know about, and the terror made him worse in the classroom, and being worse made Snape sharper with him, and the cycle fed itself. Harry had started, very quietly, helping Neville before class, not tutoring, just answering questions while they waited for Snape to arrive, and Neville had responded to this with pathetic gratitude that slowly, over weeks, became actual competence. His potion in March got a neutral comment from Snape instead of a critique, which for Neville was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. Harry mentioned it to Snape once, indirectly. Said, "Longbottom does better when he's not frightened." Snape had looked at him from across the desk in the dungeon office. Most people do. He'd be a better student if the classroom felt safer for him. A pause. "Are you suggesting I adjust my teaching approach, Mr. Potter? I'm observing that your most difficult student would be less difficult if he was less afraid of you." "I am aware," Snape said, with a flatness that meant more than it said. Then, "He is frightened of me for reasons that are not fully within my control," Snape said, and there was something in his voice that closed the topic, not defensively, but heavily, the weight of a history that Harry understood he didn't have the full picture of. "What I can do is ensure he has adequate time before class to prepare himself." Harry didn't push it. He understood the shape of what wasn't being said. That Snape's relationship with Neville was tangled up in something that involved the Longbottoms and the war, and the war's history was not a place Harry could navigate yet without more information. He filed it under things to understand later and let it be. What he did notice was that in April, Snape began arriving at the classroom 2 minutes later than usual, which was 2 minutes in which Harry, who arrived early consistently, had 2 minutes of quiet before class in which to answer Neville's last-minute questions without an audience. He noticed this and said nothing about it. He didn't need to. It was mid-April when Quirrell stopped being subtle. Harry had been watching long enough that the change in pattern was immediately obvious. For months Quirrell had been careful, the careful, systematic carefulness of someone who knows they're being watched and is working around it. But in April something shifted. The intervals between his visits to the 3rd floor shortened. He stopped being at meals with the same consistency. His classroom behavior had a new register in it, still the nervous stammer, still the professorial performance, but underneath it's something more urgent, a quickening that Harry could feel like a pressure change. Harry brought this to Snape on a Thursday evening. Snape listened. He nodded once, and then he said something Harry hadn't expected. "I know." "What do you mean, you know?" "I mean that I've observed the same pattern and I believe we're approaching the end of whatever Quirrell is planning." He was very still behind his desk. "There's something else you should know." Harry waited. "I've been investigating the protections on the 3rd floor," Snape said. "Independently, without Dumbledore's knowledge, I've assessed each one." He paused. "They're not designed to be unbreakable. They're designed to be breakable by someone with the right skills. Each one corresponds to a specific magical discipline." "A test," Harry said. "Not for Quirrell," Snape said. "For you." The office was very quiet. "Dumbledore built a series of challenges," Snape said, and his voice was entirely controlled and entirely cold in the way that Harry had learned meant he was managing anger, that an 11-year-old with specific skills could theoretically navigate. Not easily, but theoretically. Harry let that settle. "He designed it for me to go through," Harry said. "He designed it to require you," Snape said. "Whoever took Quirrell's place would need certain abilities. There is one protection in particular." He stopped. "The final chamber contains the stone, guarded by the mirror." Harry looked at him sharply. "The mirror of Arist," Snape confirmed. "Only someone who wanted to find the stone but not use it could retrieve it. Someone who wanted it for themselves would see themselves using it and could never reach it, but someone who wanted only to find it would see themselves with it in their pocket," Harry finished. He heard his own voice, saw the logic of it, saw what Dumbledore had done with the mirror, not just moved it but put it to use, at the center of a trap. At the center of a plan that had Harry's name on it from the beginning. He thought about Dumbledore saying, "I anticipated a boy who would need guidance." He thought about what Dumbledore had actually anticipated, A boy who would walk into the trap on cue, use the mirror correctly because of who he was, and retrieve the stone. The plan was elegant. It was also a plan in which Harry was not a person but a key. When? Harry said. I don't know the exact timing, Snape said, but I believe it's soon, within weeks. What are you going to do? I'm going to do what I have been doing, Snape said. Watch Quirrell, follow him when he moves. Intervene before he gets through the protections if I can. And if you can't, Snape looked at him steadily, then I'll be behind him. And Dumbledore will be exactly where he's decided to be, Snape said, which may or may not be useful. Harry sat with this for a moment. He thought about the mirror of Erist, about standing in front of it and seeing his family, about turning away from it and walking back toward the door, about Dumbledore appearing in the corridor and saying I anticipated a boy who would need guidance. He thought about what the mirror would show him now, whether it had changed. He didn't think it had changed. He still wanted the same things. But he was different in the wanting, not desperate for them, not locked in front of the glass. He wanted them the way you want something real, with patience and intention and the understanding that wanting alone doesn't make it true. I'm going to be honest with you, Harry said. If Quirrell gets through and you're not in position to stop him before he reaches the final chamber, I'm going in. Snape looked at him. I know what you're going to say, Harry said. You have no idea what I'm going to say. You're going to tell me it's dangerous and I'm 11 years old and I should leave it to the adults. I'm going to tell you, Snape said, with a precision that cut cleanly, that if you go in, I want to know before you go and I want you to take the cloak. He paused. Invisibility cloak. I know you have it. Don't look surprised. There are very few invisibility cloaks in Britain and the only one with any business being in Gryffindor Tower belonged to James Potter. You knew he had one. He used it extensively at school, Snape said, with a flatness that contained approximately 40 years of accumulated irritation. It was not an improvement to his personality. Harry almost laughed. Almost. If I go in, Harry said, you'll know. Yes, Snape said. Because you're going to tell me. Not leave a note, not send an owl, tell me in person so that I can make an informed decision about what I do next. Okay, Harry said. I need you to understand what okay means in this context, Snape said. It means I trust you to make decisions. It does not mean I'm comfortable with you making this particular one. I know, Harry said, the difference between trust and comfort. Yes, Snape said, exactly. They were quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? Harry said. You can ask. I'll decide whether to answer. The night Voldemort, the night my parents died. He kept his voice even. Where were you? Snape was very still, the kind of stillness that preceded something honest. I was told, Snape said slowly, before it happened. I was given information by Voldemort himself, information about a prophecy. I went to Dumbledore immediately. I told him everything I knew. I begged him to protect. He stopped. I begged him to protect your mother. And James, Harry said, a pause. And James, Snape said, and it was not easy and not hollow. He was your father in the ways that counted for 10 years. I do not. He stopped again. Then, I did not like James Potter. He was arrogant and careless, and he had a talent for making other people feel small that I do not think he was ever fully aware of. But he loved your mother, and he died for her and for you. I have never discounted that. Harry nodded. He sat with it and turned it over and found that it was, strangely, exactly what he'd needed to hear. Not the idealization of James Potter that Hagrid and the photographs had given him, not the negation of him that Snape's history might have produced, but something true. A person. Complicated, flawed, capable of love and cruelty simultaneously, the way most people were. Thank you, Harry said. Don't thank me, Snape said. I'm telling you the truth. It's the least you deserve. Harry stood. He picked up his bag. He was almost at the door when Snape said quietly, without looking up from the desk, "The Quidditch match on Saturday, Gryffindor against Hufflepuff." "I know," Harry said. "I'm playing." "I know you are," Snape said. "I'll be there." Harry paused, hand on the door frame. "You go to all the matches." "I go to all the matches," Snape confirmed. and then very carefully without inflection, though I find my attention is more consistently occupied in some matches than others. Harry went back to Gryffindor Tower in the April dark and felt the specific warmth of something unspoken that had been heard anyway. The match on Saturday was the best flying he'd ever done. He found the snitch in 11 minutes, having done it the hard way. A full 45-minute chase disguised as a leisurely patrol, so the Hufflepuff seeker wouldn't identify the target until Harry was already committed to the dive. He came out of it with 12 feet of altitude to spare, and the snitch beating its wings in his closed fist, and the sound of the crowd was incredible and immediate. He looked up at the stands from the pitch, from the place where he'd pulled out of the dive, and found the section where Snape always sat. He'd mapped it weeks ago, the third block left side, 6 rows up, and saw the man standing, not cheering, just standing, with his arms loose at his sides and his face open in a way Harry had learned to identify as Snape's version of something a normal person might express with both arms in the air. Harry raised the snitch. Snape inclined his head. Oliver Wood was crying again. Harry suspected Oliver cried after every match and would one day have to reckon with this as a personality trait. Fred and George were producing silver and gold sparks from their wands that spelled Potter across the sky in burning letters that faded slowly in the spring air. Harry landed. He accepted congratulations, and the team's noise, and Ron's backslapping, and Hermione's tightly controlled relief. He walked back toward the changing rooms with the specific feeling of someone who has done something with their whole self and felt it land correctly. He thought, I am 11 years old and I have a father who watches me play and doesn't cheer because cheering is not how he's built. And I understand him well enough to know that his version of cheering is standing up. He thought, my mother would have been insufferably proud. He thought, whatever happens on the 3rd floor, I am going to handle it. Not because Dumbledore needs me to, not because the story requires it, because I can, and it's the right thing, and I am done standing by while wrong things happen. He changed out of his Quidditch robes with the easy efficiency of someone who has made their decisions and found them solid underfoot. Around him, the team celebrated, and the spring evening came in through the open changing room door, and somewhere on the grounds above them, the castle stood in the light with everything it knew held carefully inside its stone, patient and enormous and very old. Harry laced his shoes and went out into the evening and walked back toward it. Chapter 5. Blood remembers the night it happened was a Tuesday in June, warm enough that the castle windows had been left open through the evening, and the air that came through them smelled of grass and the lake and the particular quality of a Scottish summer that always felt like something borrowed, a gift the weather was making without any promise of continuation. Harry knew before dinner was over. He couldn't have explained how exactly. It wasn't a specific thing he saw or heard. It was a shift in the quality of the evening, the way a sky changes before a storm, not in color but in pressure. He'd been watching Quirrell for months, and he knew the man's rhythms the way you know the rhythms of something you've tracked long enough that its patterns have become your own. And tonight Quirrell ate nothing and sat very still and twice touched his turban in a way that wasn't adjusting it. It was more like checking that it was there, which was a gesture Harry had catalogued but never assigned a meaning to until now. Whatever was living behind Quirrell's eyes was ready. Harry looked at his plate and then at the teacher's table and then at Snape, who was already looking at him with the steady, controlled attention that meant he'd arrived at the same conclusion. Their eyes met across the hall for exactly 1 second. Harry gave the smallest possible nod. Snape looked away. He told Ron and Hermione after dinner, in the corridor outside the Great Hall while the other students moved toward common rooms and staircases and the comfortable routines of a June evening. "Tonight," he said. Hermione looked at him. Her face did something quick and complicated and settled into the expression she wore when she was processing something alarming and choosing not to perform the alarm. "You're sure?" Quirrell didn't eat. He's been planning something for a week, and tonight the thing he's been planning has become the thing he's doing. He looked at both of them. "I have to go to Snape." "We'll come," Ron said immediately, with the flat certainty of someone who has already had this conversation with himself and arrived at the conclusion well in advance. "You can't," Harry said. "Not to Snape, that conversation is mine, but I need you to do something." He looked at Hermione. "If I go in and something goes wrong, not wrong enough that it's obvious, but wrong in a way that means I don't come back in a reasonable time frame, I need you to get McGonagall." "How long is a reasonable time frame?" Hermione asked. 2 hours. "Harry, I'll be faster than that," he said. "But 2 hours." Ron said, "We should come with you, into the corridor, into all of it." "No," Harry said, and his voice was gentle about it. "This is mine to do. You two have done everything right this year, and I need you to keep doing it right, which means being where you're supposed to be and being ready to get an adult if something goes wrong." He paused. "You're my backup. That's not a small thing." Ron looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was working hard and not entirely succeeding at concealing how much he didn't like this. 2 hours, Ron said. 2 hours, Harry confirmed. Hermione hugged him. Quick, fierce, the kind of hug that knows it needs to happen and gets on with it. Ron punched him on the shoulder, which was Ron's version of the same thing. Harry left them in the corridor and went to find Snape. The dungeon office was lit by 2 lamps, and Snape was already in his traveling cloak when Harry came through the door, which was not quite a surprise. "Quirrell," Harry said. "Yes," Snape said. "Tonight. You've been watching him. He left his quarters 20 minutes ago." Snape was pulling on gloves with the economy of movement of someone who has been ready for this for some time. "I've been tracking his path through the castle. He's going to the 3rd floor. Harry put his bag down on the chair and reached into it and pulled out the invisibility cloak and laid it over his arm. Snape looked at it, then at Harry. "I'm coming," Harry said, not asking. "I know," Snape said, not arguing, a pause. "I'm going to try to intercept him before the final chamber," Snape said. "That is my intention. What I need you to understand is that if something prevents that, if something prevents it, I'll be there," Harry said. "With the cloak. I won't do anything you couldn't see. Is that clear enough?" Snape looked at him for a moment. There was something in his face in the lamplight that was neither of the things Harry usually saw from him, not the armor and not the thing beneath the armor. It was something more direct than either, something that cost more. "If anything happens to you," Snape said very quietly, "I want you to know that I will not." He stopped, started again differently. "I need you to survive this. Not because of the stone, not because of Voldemort. Because you are." He stopped a second time, and the stopping was not inability. It was the same thing Harry did when he needed to say something exactly right and was making sure of the words before he used them. "I know," Harry said, quietly, meaning all of it. Snape looked at him. The lamplight did something warm and complicated to his face. "Stay close," Snape said, "and stay under the cloak unless I tell you otherwise." They left the dungeon together, and Harry pulled the cloak over himself as they reached the stairs, and Snape walked through the castle alone, visibly alone, and Harry walked beside him in the silence of being invisible, which was a different quality of silence from being unseen. Being invisible meant that the world moved around you without adjusting to you. The castle at night opened up differently when it didn't know you were there. 3rd floor corridor. The door at the end was already open, not broken open, not forced. Open, as if someone had simply unlocked it and walked through, which was either because Quirrell had the means or because the door had recognized something in him that it shouldn't have. Snape looked at the open door for a moment and then went through it, and Harry followed. The 3-headed dog was unconscious. It was enormous in the way that you forgot from descriptions. The sheer physical fact of 3 heads, each the size of a pony, lying in a heap of unconscious fur on the floor of the chamber. There was a harp nearby, strings still faintly vibrating, the last note of whatever music had put the creature under just barely still audible in the stone. Snape looked at the dog. He looked at the trapdoor in the floor, which was open. He looked at Harry, which meant he knew approximately where Harry was. He'd been doing this all the way through the castle, adjusting his field of awareness to include the space beside him where there was no visible presence but where he knew one existed. He dropped through the trapdoor. Harry followed. The devil's snare reached for Snape immediately, which meant it reached for Harry too, and Harry had spent enough time with herbology to know the response. He relaxed completely, let the plant feel him as something non-threatening, and it loosened. Snape had already produced a thin blue flame from his wand that the plant pulled away from with a rustling that sounded almost offended. They landed on the stone floor below, and Snape moved without pausing. The Flying Keys room had been navigated already. They could see it from the fact that one of the keys had been caught and left on the lock, still turning slightly. Snape looked at it, and then at the broom that had been knocked from its hook. Harry thought about Quirrell with his turban and his trembling hands catching a key on a broom, and tried to reconcile that image with what he now understood about the thing inhabiting Quirrell's body. He couldn't. The reconciliation wasn't possible. Whatever Voldemort currently was, he could direct his host with a skill and focus that had no relationship to Quirrell's own capacities. The troll chamber, the troll was already unconscious, knocked cleanly off its feet, and Harry was glad he hadn't needed to levitate another club because the one lying near the wall was enormous and looked much heavier than a feather. The fire room. This one Snape stopped at. There were two fires, black and purple, burning at opposite ends of the narrow chamber, a table with 7 bottles arranged on it. He went to the table and stood looking at the bottles for a moment. "A logic puzzle," he said quietly in Harry's direction. "The smallest bottle will get one person through the black fire." He picked it up and turned it. A pause. "There's barely enough for one person." "Quirrell went through," Harry said, voice low. "The black fire went back up after," Snape said. "He's through. I'll need the potion to follow." He set it down and looked at the purple fire at the other end of the chamber. "You'd have to go back." Harry pulled the cloak down from his face, just his face. "I'm not going back." "The purple fire has an ice potion to navigate it. There was enough produced for 2. Snape was looking at him with an expression that had given up on certain things. "You could get through the purple fire and go for help." "We've had this conversation," Harry said. "I know we have," Snape said with a weariness that was not frustration. It was the weariness of someone who has already accepted the outcome and is making the record. "I'm making the offer. You're declining it." "I'm declining it," Harry said. Snape was quiet for one moment. Then, "The small bottle gets one person through the black fire. If you drink it, it won't leave enough for me." Harry looked at him. Then he looked at the table at all 7 bottles. He walked to it and stood over them, and he looked at them the way he looked at everything, with the full attention that noticed what was actually there rather than what was expected. He picked up the largest bottle, clear liquid, slightly viscous. He brought it to his nose. "This isn't part of the puzzle," he said. Snape looked at it. Something changed in his expression. "What do you mean?" "The puzzle has 7 bottles," Harry said, "but whoever set it up left something behind. This one's been opened." He looked at Snape directly. "And it's not a potion. It's diluted draft of living death, diluted to the point of being almost harmless, harmless enough to touch the black fire without full activation, but still enough that anyone who drank it would." He paused. "Who set this protection?" "I did," Snape said very quietly. Harry looked at him. "I set a logic puzzle," Snape said, with a controlled deliberateness that suggested he was working through something as he spoke. "There was no additional bottle. Someone has interfered with my protection." "Quirrell," Harry said, or whatever is directing him. They came through and left something behind. He set the bottle down carefully. They wanted whoever followed to find it and drink it, eliminate the pursuit. Snape looked at the bottle for a moment with an expression Harry had never seen from him, something that was very contained anger, and underneath it something more personal. "Don't touch it again," Snape said. "I wasn't planning to." Snape went back to the original small bottle, picked it up, turned it. "This gets one of us through the black fire," he said. "The question is which one?" "You," Harry said without hesitation. Snape looked at him. "You can do things in there that I can't yet," Harry said. "I'm not being modest, I'm being accurate. Whatever's in the final chamber is Voldemort, and you have more tools for that than I do. I'm going back through the purple fire and getting Dumbledore." Snape was very still. "That's your plan," he said. "That's my plan," Harry said. "You go forward, I go back for Dumbledore. Unless," he paused, "unless there's something you think Dumbledore won't do that needs to be done." Snape looked at him for a long moment. "Dumbledore will not destroy him," Snape said quietly. "He will contain him, drive him out of Quirrell. The contingency is not Dumbledore being unwilling to act, it's Dumbledore not arriving in time." "Then you need to hold it," Harry said. "Hold until Dumbledore gets there." "Harry." "I know," Harry said. "I know what I'm sending you into." "That's not," Snape stopped. His jaw was tight. "That's not what I was about to say." "What were you about to say?" A silence. Snape looked at him fully, with nothing managed about it. "I was going to say that if this goes wrong, if something happens in there and Dumbledore arrives too late." He stopped again. Then, with a precision that cost something considerable, "I need you to know that the last year has been the most significant of my life. Because of you, because of having you in it." Harry's throat did something complicated. He held it. "It hasn't gone wrong yet," Harry said. "No," Snape said. "And you're not the sort of person things go wrong for," Harry said. "You're the sort that makes them go right." Something shifted in Snape's face. Something that was almost, not quite, not yet, but almost a smile. "That is the most optimistic thing I've ever heard you say." "Don't tell anyone," Harry said. "It'll ruin my reputation." Snape looked at him for one more moment. Then he uncorked the small bottle and drank it and walked through the black fire without looking back. And Harry stood on the other side of the flame and watched him disappear into whatever was beyond it. Then he turned and ran. Through the troll chamber. Through the chess room. The chess pieces had been blasted aside by Quirrell's passage and lay in broken marble heaps across the board. He went through the flying keys chamber, through the devil's snare, back up through the trapdoor, the three-headed dog stirring slightly as the music's influence faded, and then he was through the main door and in the third-floor corridor and running. He was at Dumbledore's office in 4 minutes. The stone gargoyle looked at him. Harry looked back. "I need Dumbledore," he said. "Right now. It's happening, the third floor. Quirrell has gone through all the protections and Snape is in the final chamber. This is happening now." The gargoyle looked at him for 1 second that felt much longer. Then it stepped aside. Harry went up the spiral staircase 2 steps at a time and knocked once on the office door and went in without waiting for an answer, because there wasn't time for waiting. Dumbledore was at his desk, and he looked up when Harry came through the door, and his expression did something Harry had not expected. It resolved into clarity. Not surprise. Not alarm. The specific clarity of someone who has been expecting a thing and has just been told it has arrived. "Harry," Dumbledore said, already standing. "Third floor. Quirrell is through everything. Snape's in the final chamber." Harry met his eyes directly. "If you have a reason for not going immediately, I need you to tell me what it is." Dumbledore looked at him for 1 second, a full, searching second, and then he moved. He moved faster than Harry expected an old man to move. His traveling cloak was on in 3 seconds, and he was at the door in 5 and in the corridor in 6. And Harry ran alongside him and thought, watching Dumbledore move, that the warmth and the twinkle and the avuncular performance were a costume. And underneath the costume was something much more formidable, something that had been managing itself very carefully for a very long time and had just stopped managing. "You went for me instead of going in," Dumbledore said, not breaking pace. "Snape went in," Harry said. "He can hold it longer than I can. I can run faster than most alternatives. The arithmetic was straightforward." A pause. "And you decided this in how long?" "A few seconds," Harry said. "The logic was there." "The logic," Dumbledore repeated. There was something in his voice that Harry would think about later when there was time to think, something that sounded like recalibration. Yes, the logic was there. They went into the third-floor corridor, through the door, down the trapdoor. Dumbledore navigated the protections with an ease that suggested he was moving through something familiar. He knew each room, knew the solution, and Harry understood that this was the point. Dumbledore had built this. He knew every passage of it. The black fire at the end of the logic room was already dying down, the potion that Snape had used working through its duration. Dumbledore produced his wand and said something very quiet, and the fire went out entirely, and they went through. The final chamber was enormous, or perhaps it seemed enormous because of what was happening in it. Harry processed it the way he processed things under pressure, fast, in order of importance. The mirror of Arist against the far wall, exactly where it had been in the fifth-floor room. Quirrell in the center of the chamber, standing very still, facing Snape. And Snape was still on his feet. That was the first thing Harry registered, the active quality of still on his feet, which meant that whatever had happened in the time between Harry leaving and arriving back had not gone entirely wrong. But it had gone partially wrong. Snape's left arm was at an angle that was not natural, and there was blood at his temple, and his wand was in his hand, but the hand was trembling in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the effort of holding something back. "Harry," Quirrell said. Not Quirrell's voice. The same pitch, the same tone, but the stammer was gone, and what was left was something older and colder and very, very deliberate. The thing that had been looking out from behind his eyes for a year looked at Harry directly for the first time, and Harry felt it, not fear, but the particular attentiveness that enormous things produce, the way you feel the presence of the ocean before you see it. "I've been waiting for you," said the voice in Quirrell's throat. "Dumbledore, I did not expect quite yet, but you, Harry, you've been in my thoughts considerably." Dumbledore stepped into the chamber beside Harry. His wand was out and his face was doing nothing, the complete stillness that Harry recognized as absolute focus. "Tom," Dumbledore said. "Albus," the voice said. "You've been very patient this year, letting your protections do their work, waiting to see who would come through them." A pause. "You built this for him, didn't you, the boy? You built all of it with him in mind." "I built it to prevent the stone from being taken," Dumbledore said. "You built it to give him a story," the voice said with a precision that had no warmth in it. "You've been giving him a story since the night you left him on a doorstep, the boy who lived, the hero in waiting, every obstacle carefully calibrated." A pause. "But he didn't come through, did he? He sent someone else and went for help. That wasn't in your story." Harry was watching Snape. He was watching the way Snape's weight was distributed, the arm angle, the specific quality of the trembling, not fatigue, he thought, something else. Something that had been done to the arm rather than that had grown in it. He looked at Quirrell's hands. The left one was slightly raised, fingers spread, and the angle of it was the angle of maintained focus. He was using magic against Snape without a wand, holding something in place, keeping Snape's arm at that angle. Harry looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore's eyes moved to him for one fraction of a second. He'd seen it too. "The stone," the voice said. "I need only the stone, Albus. Everything else can be negotiated." "The stone is not negotiable," Dumbledore said, "because you've promised it to Flamel, because you've decided its destruction serves the greater good." A pause. "The greater good," your favorite phrase, the thing you use to make the painful choices comfortable. Harry looked at the mirror. He looked at what was in the mirror. In the reflection, his reflection, Mirror Harry was reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small red stone, and it caught the light in a way that was almost playful. And then Mirror Harry put it back in his pocket, and his face was doing the thing Harry had seen when he'd stood here at Christmas. The expression of someone who has everything they need. He felt it in his pocket, the actual stone in his actual pocket. He understood the magic without needing it explained. The mirror had done it. He'd looked at it with the right intent, the intent that was simply find it, don't use it, and the stone had come to him the way magic came to him when he let it, directly and without ceremony. He closed his hand around it through his pocket without reaching in. Harry. The voice from Quirrell was different now. It knew. What do you have in your pocket? Nothing you're getting, Harry said. Quirrell turned fully toward him for the first time, and the thing behind his eyes turned with him, and it was very large and very old and very hungry, and Harry looked at it directly. You're 11 years old, the voice said, and it was almost amused. You're standing in a chamber 60 feet underground holding the most powerful object in the world, and you're 11 years old. Nearly 12, Harry said. And the object's in my pocket, not in yours, so I'm not sure what point you're making. Quirrell moved. He crossed the chamber in 3 steps, and his hand shot out and grabbed Harry's wrist, and something happened that Harry had not anticipated. Not the grabbing, not the attack, but the result of the attack. Where Quirrell's hand closed around his wrist, Quirrell screamed. Not a strategic scream. The genuine, involuntary sound of something burning. Harry felt it too, a heat in his skin that was not pain but was something deeper than pain, something that went below sensation into whatever was underneath it, the level where magic lived before it became anything performed. He didn't pull away. He turned his arm over so his palm was facing up, and he pressed it flat against Quirrell's hand. Quirrell screamed again and stumbled back. Snape moved. The moment Quirrell's concentration broke, the thing holding Snape's arm released, and Snape crossed the distance between himself and Quirrell in 2 steps, and his wand was at Quirrell's throat, and his voice was absolutely quiet when he said, "Stop." Quirrell stopped. He was staring at his own hand. The skin where it had contacted Harry's was blistered in a way that looked wrong, that looked like more than a burn, that looked like whatever had made contact hadn't been ordinary heat. "Harry," Dumbledore said from across the chamber, "come away from him." Harry stepped back. "Your mother's protection," Dumbledore said. His voice was very quiet and very specific. "Her sacrifice. It lives in your skin, Harry, in your blood. It is the most ancient magic there is, and it is specifically fatal to whatever Quirinus Quirrell currently hosts." "I know about my mother's protection," Harry said. "I worked it out from Bagshot's History of Magic in February." Dumbledore was quiet for 1 second. "Right," he said. Quirrell had gone very still. Snape's wand was at his throat, and the thing that had been looking out from Quirrell's eyes was looking at Harry now with an expression that was. Harry took a moment to name it correctly, resignation. Not fear, not rage. The resignation of something that has been here before, that recognizes this particular moment as a thing it has already survived once and is not certain it will survive again. "You should know," Harry said to it, "that I'm not doing this because Dumbledore planned for me to. I'm doing it because you killed my parents and you've been trying to come back ever since and you're not getting the stone." "Magnanimous," the voice said. Thin now, thinner than it had been, as if the contact with Harry's skin had diminished something. "Not magnanimous," Harry said, "just clear." Dumbledore stepped past Harry and stood in front of Quirrell and looked at what was behind the man's eyes with an expression that had the quality of something very old looking at something equally old and arriving at the end of a very long argument. "It's over, Tom," Dumbledore said. "Leave the body." "If I leave the body," the voice said, "I have nothing, no form, nothing." "Yes," Dumbledore said, "that's correct." A pause. "You're sentencing me to nothing." "I'm giving you the choice," Dumbledore said. "Leave Quirinus voluntarily and retain whatever remains of yourself. Or I remove you, which is less comfortable and considerably less complete. The thing in Quirrell's eyes looked at Dumbledore for a long moment. It looked at Snape. It looked at Harry. Then Quirrell convulsed. It happened fast, his whole body arching, his hands clutching the air, his face going through a series of expressions that were not quite human, and a sound came from him that was two sounds at once, Quirrell's voice and something else layered under it, something that had no real business being audible but was anyway. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Harry felt it in his teeth, in the back of his skull. Dumbledore's wand moved. Precise, quick, a complex movement that Harry watched and filed and couldn't yet replicate but understood the principle of. The cold broke, snapped like a bone or like ice on a river, a crack that went through the chamber and then was gone, and in the silence that followed, Quirrell folded to the floor. Not dramatically, just folded, the way a person does when the thing holding them up leaves. Snape was beside him before he finished falling, his good hand at Quirrell's neck, and he looked up at Dumbledore. "He's alive," he said, "barely." "Yes," Dumbledore said, "it was the best I could offer him." The chamber was very quiet. The mirror reflected all of them, and Harry glanced at his own reflection and saw what he expected. No stone in the mirror pocket. Just himself, standing in a room underground with his father and the most powerful wizard alive and a man who had been used as a vehicle for something ancient and terrible. He reached into his pocket and brought out the stone. It sat in his palm. Small, ruby red, and warm in the way that living things are warm rather than the way fire is warm. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about Flamel, 665 years old in Devon. He thought about immortality as a concept, about the stone's power, about what it meant to be able to stop death. He thought about his mother. He thought about what she had stopped, not with a stone, not with alchemy, but with the oldest and most irreducible magic there was. He held it out to Dumbledore. Dumbledore took it. He held it in both hands and looked at it, and his face did something that Harry thought he wasn't meant to see. Something that was not about the stone, but about the moment, about the year, about the boy standing in front of him who had come through every part of this as something other than what had been planned. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "I know," Harry said. "You're going to say something about bravery." "I was going to say I owe you an apology," Dumbledore said. This was not what Harry had expected. He looked at Dumbledore directly. "Several, in fact," Dumbledore said. He was very careful with the words, the way he was careful about everything, but the care felt different from its usual quality, less managed, more honest. "I have made decisions about your life, significant decisions from a very early age based on what I believed was necessary. And I was not wrong about the necessity." He paused. "But I was wrong to make those decisions without you. And I continued to be wrong each time I chose management over conversation. Each time I decided what you needed to know rather than telling you the truth." Harry was quiet. "The 10 years with the Dursleys," Dumbledore said, and his voice here had something in it that the rest of the speech had not quite had, something that bore weight, that carried it openly rather than distributing it across other considerations. "I placed you there believing it was the safest option. I was not wrong about the safety. I was wrong about everything else. About what that life would cost you, about whether cost was mine to decide." "Why are you telling me this now?" Harry said. "Because you came and got me," Dumbledore said. "You could have gone through yourself. You could have retrieved the stone. You had every capacity for it, and we both know that." He paused. "You chose to run for help instead, for Severus, for me." Another pause. "I built this situation expecting a particular story, and you told a different one, a better one in which people who care about each other work together instead of performing heroism alone." He looked at Harry for a long moment. "I should have written that story from the beginning." Harry thought about this. He thought about it thoroughly, the way he thought about potions, problems, and charm theory and the logic of things, giving it the full attention it required. "You're not wrong about the blood protection," Harry said finally. Putting me with the Dursleys, you weren't wrong about that specific thing. No, Dumbledore said, but the blood protection didn't require 10 years of no, Harry agreed. It didn't. A silence, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that comes after something true has been said and needs time to settle. Are we going to do this differently? Harry said. Going forward. Dumbledore looked at him. I would very much like to. Then we will, Harry said simply. Snape, from the floor where he was still beside Quirrell, making quick, precise movements with his wand, said without looking up, "If this conversation is finished, I would appreciate assistance transporting Quirrell to the hospital wing before he bleeds on the stone floor of my chamber any further." Your chamber, Dumbledore said mildly. My protection was the one he interfered with, Snape said. I'm claiming custody of the room. The logic is, Dumbledore paused. Inescapable, he concluded. Harry went to Snape's side and Snape looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was fine, which was sufficient, which was them. Your arm, Harry said. Will be fine, Snape said. It was held at a wrong angle for. I'm aware of how long it was held at a wrong angle, Snape said. I was there. Madame Pomfrey will need to. Yes, Snape said, with the tone of someone who is going to make absolutely sure they get to Madame Pomfrey last and under their own power. After Quirrell. Harry crouched beside him and helped him stabilize Quirrell for the levitation charm Dumbledore performed, and Snape let him help with the natural acceptance of someone who has decided not to perform independence when it would be stupid to do so. They carried Quirrell out through the 6 chambers, the fire room, the chess board with its broken pieces, the flying keys, the devil's snare, and up through the trapdoor where the 3-headed dog lay snoring with the deep, untroubled peace of something enormous in a deep sleep, and back through the 3rd-floor corridor and into the inhabited parts of the castle. The hospital wing was bright and smelled of potions and clean linen. Madame Pomfrey appeared from her office and took in the levitated, unconscious professor, Snape's arm, the blood at his temple, and Harry's general state, and produced a sequence of expressions that suggested she had a lot of thoughts and had decided to triage them. Bed, she said to Snape, not a request. Quirrell first, Snape said. I'll handle Professor Quirrell, Dumbledore said. Severus, bed. Snape sat on a bed with the resigned air of someone losing an argument they hadn't fully committed to winning. Madame Pomfrey was already at his arm with her wand, and he was looking at the ceiling with the focused stillness of someone enduring something uncomfortable and not dignifying it by acknowledging it. Harry sat down in the chair beside the bed. Not going anywhere, Snape looked at him. You can go back to your dormitory, Snape said. I can, Harry agreed. Pomfrey will not appreciate. She can tell me to leave, Harry said. She hasn't. Madame Pomfrey from Snape's arm said nothing, which was its own kind of permission. Snape looked at the ceiling again. The lamplight in the hospital wing was softer than the dungeon light, warmer. His face in it was tired in a way that the armor didn't quite cover, the tiredness that comes after something finished that took sustained effort to sustain. The draft of living death in the logic room, he said. The one Quirrell left. You identified it by smell and consistency. Yes, Harry said. You're 11 years old, nearly 12. Stop saying that, Harry almost smiled. I read a lot. You read everything, Snape said. It's excessive. You read everything too, Harry said. Snape was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I do. Another pause. I'm going to tell Hermione and Ron, Harry said. About you, about what you are to me, what I am to you. He paused. I should have told them earlier. I was waiting until I understood it properly. And now you do. Now I understand it well enough to share it, Harry said, which isn't the same thing but is enough. Snape was quiet for a moment. His jaw did something complicated. What do you expect them to say? Hermione will ask 17 questions in alphabetical order, Harry said. Ron will need a few minutes and then he'll be fine. He's better at adapting than people give him credit for. And after, Harry looked at him directly. After it's just true. It was always true, it's just that more people will know it. Snape looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the ceiling again and was quiet for a while, and Madame Pomfrey finished with his arm and moved to his temple, and he endured this without comment. "Your mother," Snape said after a while to the ceiling. "If she'd known about the chamber tonight, about what you did—" He stopped. "She'd have been terrified," Harry said. "Yes." "And then she'd have been insufferably proud," Snape said, quietly, with something in his voice that was wholly unguarded. "Yes," Harry said. The hospital wing was quiet. Somewhere across the room, Quirrell was in a bed behind drawn curtains, and Dumbledore was with him. And whatever came next for Quirrell was something Harry would think about later, the ethics of it, what justice meant for someone who had been simultaneously a perpetrator and a vehicle, what the wizarding world's capacity for mercy looked like when it wasn't convenient. Later. There was time. He thought about the year. He thought about a cupboard under stairs, and a letter in precise handwriting, and a vial of memory, and the taste of something silvery going down at 2 in the morning, and a kitchen he'd never been in, and a woman with red hair and bright eyes who had loved without reservation and strategized without mercy, sometimes simultaneously. He thought about the Sorting Hat saying, "You will not stand by while something wrong is happening and call it someone else's problem." He thought about the mirror showing him a letter, just a letter, an ordinary one between people who'd agreed the extraordinary was real. He thought, this is the start of something, not the end of anything, not a conclusion, the beginning of the long, ordinary, extraordinary work of being exactly what he was, Lily Evans's son, Severus Snape's son, no one's chess piece, no one's symbol, a boy becoming himself in a school that taught magic and in a family that was still learning its own shape. "Professor," Harry said. "What?" Snape said to the ceiling. "Thank you," Harry said, "for the letter, for the memory, for coming with me tonight, for all of it." Snape was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Harry thought the conversation had finished. Then Snape said, very quietly, still looking at the ceiling, "Thank you for writing back." Harry looked at his hands, looked at the place on his wrist where Quirrell had grabbed him, where the skin was still faintly warm with something that was his mother's love made physical, made permanent, made into the kind of magic that didn't require a wand or a word or any performance at all. Blood remembers, he thought. That was what the title of the Bagshot chapter had been. The one on ancient protection magic, the one he'd read in February in the library and thought was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever encountered. Blood remembers. Love, rendered into the body, becomes its own spell. It does not require renewal. It does not require intention. It simply is, and it persists, and it does not forget what it was given to protect. He thought about his mother's hands and the green blanket and a man's palm resting against it for one moment in a warm kitchen, and the distance that had become permanent, and the love that had become something else. A protection, a letter, a year of difficult conversations in dungeon offices, a man standing up in the Quidditch stands and inclining his head. Outside the hospital wing windows, the Scottish summer was happening without them. The sky lightening toward the particular blue of early morning, the grounds coming into focus below, the lake catching the first light and holding it. Harry sat beside his father's bed and waited for the morning and was not afraid of any of it. 3 days later he was back in the hospital wing, but this time as a visitor with a clear discharge date, and Hermione and Ron were with him, and he told them. He told them the whole thing, the letter, the memory, the year, all of it, and Hermione asked 9 questions before she caught herself and started over in a more organized fashion, and Ron sat very still for 3 minutes and then said, "So Snape is actually," and then stopped, and then said, "Right. Okay. That's," and then stopped again and then said, "Are you all right?" which was the most important question and the one Harry had been waiting for. "Yes," Harry said, "I am actually." Ron nodded slowly. Okay, he said, then, does that mean I have to be nicer to him in class? It means you don't have to be any particular thing, Harry said. Just know who he is to me. Ron thought about this. Fair enough, he said. Hermione was already reorganizing her mental architecture to accommodate the information. Harry could see her doing it. The careful, thoughtful way she incorporated new data that changed existing structures. She was going to have more questions. She was going to have them for weeks. He was completely fine with that. They sat in the corridor outside the hospital wing in the June morning and talked about the year, all of it, the parts they'd shared and the parts they hadn't, the parts that had been frightening and the parts that had been extraordinary. They talked about Quirrell, about what came next for him, about what it meant that Voldemort had been driven out again but not destroyed. They talked about the stone, which Dumbledore had told Harry quietly that morning would be destroyed. Flamel had agreed, and had said, in a letter that was apparently very serene about the whole thing, that after 600 years he was reasonably comfortable with the prospect. They talked about next year, about what they wanted to learn, what they wanted to do, what Hogwarts looked like from the end of the first year versus how it had looked from the beginning. Harry looked at the two of them, Ron leaning against the wall with his long legs stretched out and his expression thoughtful for once, no performance in it. Hermione with her knees drawn up and a book she wasn't reading in her lap because she was too engaged to read, and felt the particular warmth of something he'd looked at in a mirror in December. Not quite what the mirror had shown, not the exact picture, but the same thing in a different configuration, people who were his and who he was theirs, in the ordinary, unremarkable way that didn't require explanation. Down the corridor, the hospital wing door opened and Madame Pomfrey appeared and said, "He's awake and he says he doesn't need visitors," in the tone of someone repeating a message they disagreed with. Harry stood up. "Tell him I'll be there in a minute." He said. "I know what he said," Harry said. "Tell him anyway." Madame Pomfrey looked at him for a moment. Then she went back inside. Ron said from the floor, "Should we come?" "Give us a minute," Harry said. Then yes. He went into the hospital wing and walked to the bed in the corner and sat down in the chair that had become his chair over the last 3 days. And Snape looked at him with the expression he wore when he was going to say something about not needing company. "I know," Harry said before he said it. "Then why?" "Because I'm here," Harry said. "I'll go when you're well enough to throw me out yourself." Snape was quiet. "Ron and Hermione want to come in," Harry said. "I told them to give us a minute." Something moved in Snape's expression. "They know. I told them 3 days ago. And Ron wants to know if he has to be nicer to you in class." Snape looked at him. "What did you say?" "I said he didn't have to be any particular thing." Snape was quiet for a moment. That was the right answer. "I know," Harry said. Outside the windows the grounds were full of June light, and the lake was the deep green blue of a good summer, and somewhere out there Hogwarts was getting ready to end and begin again, the way it had ended and begun again for 1,000 years, patient and enormous, and full of everything that people had put into it. Harry looked at his father and thought about the letter he'd written at Christmas. Just a letter, an ordinary one. The kind that exists between people who don't need to explain the extraordinary because they've already agreed that it's real. He thought, next year he'd write more of them. He thought, next year was going to be something else entirely. He thought, good. Outside, Ron's voice said something to Hermione that made her laugh, and the laugh came through the hospital wing door warm and clear, and Snape looked at the door for a moment and then looked at Harry and didn't say anything, which was, by now, a language Harry spoke fluently. He got up and opened the door and waved them in.